Good. So thanks everyone for joining us for this workshop. So as I said, I'm Moel Haj. I'm senior lecturer at Lancaster University working on NLP, and readability is one of my interests. And I'll explain how this idea about like a first workshop on readability for low resource languages came in the next slides. So this was a discussion with my colleagues, so Professor Hendel Khalifa from King Saud University and Dr. Abdul Karim At-Tamimi from Sheffield Hallam University, and we were discussing some work about readability. But then we realized there is some sort of a gap, and also there is a lack of discussions in big conferences on readability. And we thought it'd be nice to have a workshop that will gather people around, and then we can know and discuss the ideas or recent techniques on readability. Also, like hear what other people doing, especially on resource languages and the resource languages. So before we start, all the attendees will have their mics and cameras off automatically. It's just what Teams does. But after any talk, if you have any questions, you can click on the raise hand button, and then one of us can unmute you or even turn on your camera if you want and ask the speaker a question. But the rest of you could just add your question directly in the chat. So if the speaker sees the chat, they can answer you directly, or they will wait until the end of the talk. Otherwise, myself or any of the other organizers could read the question out loud, so the rest could hear it. But as I said, you can write your questions in anytime you want. Just because of time, we might not be able to answer all questions, so feel free to contact the speakers directly. And as I said, this will be recorded, so we can publish it later. So the main objectives of what we call RL 2023 is basically to discuss and explore new approaches for assessing readability. We want to focus on challenges basically for low resource languages, and finally highlight the value of readability in those low resource languages, and what can be done for them to be like having the same kind of focus as the well-resourced ones. So this is just basic stuff. Most of you might know that already, but we were trying to talk about the importance of readability in general. Why does someone need to know if the text is readable or not? So one of the few things that we focus on, but there's a lot out there, is, for example, audience engagement. And basically, it's just to like ensure that the content you have is suitable for the target audience that you're trying to talk to. So basically, if you're like creating school books or like textbook material, you want to make sure that they are suitable for the age of the children reading it, so they can understand it. And again, like you need to have some clear communication, and evaluating readability enhance that kind of stuff if it's done correctly. And finally, exclusivity. So it's not always about children. It could also be about like an audience that has readability difficulties compared to other people. So you want to make sure that your text is readable. As we've seen, like a lot of websites nowadays, we say it's accessible. So we need to have something similar for textual content. And in NLP, you might have seen this, but as I said, there isn't much in conferences these days. The focus is going in different direction, but readability in NLP could help in things like search and retrieval. So it might help like indexing the data in a better way to provide you with the data that is more readable for yourself. And there has been a lot of talk, so that is now tackled. So on summarization and generation of textual material. So you could say, could you summarize this for a child of like 10 years old? So the text will be like changed in a way to be able to be read by that age. And the same thing for translation and localization. And we've seen nowadays, if you're using one of the language models online, whether it's Llama or like ChatGPT or the others, you could actually prompt things that says, could you explain this to me in plain English, or could you write this or rewrite this in a language that is suitable for a 7-year-old, 10-year-old, and so on. So the language will change. And again, you could just say, could you write this in more difficult language or more professional languages? So that can be done. So this is where some of the readability stuff could be done. I'm sure our speakers will focus more on that, and then they will have different ideas and techniques that they've used for readability. So if you were aware of the ways readability is assessed in the past, so most of them, and still now, they use what we call readability formulas. So those are metrics that based on arithmetic formulas that has been, I think, created sometime in the 70s and 80s based on textbooks from the US schooling system. And it tries to say, okay, if the text readability is, let's say, 80, so that text can be read by a child on like fourth grade, and so on. So they had these metrics like Flesch and Fogg, for example, but they are very basic. So they use simplistic metrics. So they focus on things like the word length, the sentence length. They focus on syllables, vowels, and things like that. But they don't much focus on things like vocabulary and sentence structure. So if you say the girl ate the apple, or the apple ate the girl, or apple ate girl, that they will all have the same score if you use those formulas. And then the other limitation is about the context. So the formula struggles with specialized content like culture nuance, making them unreadable for specific audience and domains. And finally, they ignore cognitive factors and they disregard individual differences, like they don't think about pair knowledge. There's no semantic involved. So these kind of limitation makes them very limited. And to to my surprise, like these metrics are still used in several domains. Like for example, in accounting and finance, the Fogg metric is actually used for financial text, which I find a bit strange because financial text is a bit of high level. It's kind of difficult to read anyway. And to assess it using a formula that was based on school books from the 80s is a bit like not suitable for that kind of process. All right, so I'll stop here, but I'm just going to talk about the rest. So if you want to see the program, you can scan this QR code. I will also paste that link in the chat. So we have 11 talks, and I'm going to explain what those are. We follow British summertime. We don't have summer, but it is British summertime that we follow. We start at 9:30, like now, and finish by 4 p.m. There will be time for questions, as I said, so just raise your hand or just type your question in the chat. There will be lunch and coffee breaks. If the speaker is still available online, feel free to chat to them. And if they're happy to answer you back, that will be up to them. But you can use the lunch break and coffee breaks to stay online and then talk to others in chat, basically. So the list of speakers start by our two keynote speakers. So we have Professor Violetta Cavalli-Sforza from Al Akhawayn University in Morocco, and we have Professor Lawrence Anthony from Waseda University in Japan. Thanks very much for joining us. We also have a spotlight talk that will be presented by Professor Nizar Habash from New York University, Abu Dhabi, work done by him and also with Professor Hanida Taha from Zayed University in UAE. And that will be the spotlight talk later about the project they've done on readability. The organizers, in addition to me, so there will be two more talks by the organizers, one by Dr. Abdul Karim Al-Tamimi from Sheffield Hallam University and Professor Hendel Khalifa from King Saud University. And then we have 6 abstracts accepted out of 11 that have been submitted. So we have a nice variety of different languages, different contexts, and different usage of readability metrics. Our speakers span from like different areas around the world. So we've got speakers from like South Africa, the US, Brazil, France. So it is going to be a nice and exciting list of speakers. We look forward to that. And that's it from me. And I'll come back to the Teams and stop sharing so I can introduce the first speaker, which is Lawrence. Okay, so if anyone has any question, just please put them in the chat. So I'm going to look at the chat to see if anyone has any question. And at the same time, I'm going to paste in the program for people who can't access the QR code. Sorry, Lawrence, I'll be there in a second. Right. Okay, cool. So we have our first speaker, if anyone has any questions. All right, so here we have, so our first speaker is Professor Lawrence Anthony from Waseda University in Japan. So Lawrence is a professor of applied linguistics at the Faculty of Science and Engineering at Waseda University. It's a bit late in Japan, so really thank you, Lawrence, for staying online for that. So Lawrence has his PhD in applied linguistics. Is it from Manchester University, if I'm not wrong?
Birmingham, University of Birmingham.
Oh, it's Birmingham. So that's your master degree. Is it from Manchester? That's bachelor degree. Yeah. Okay, so Lawrence is the founding member of the Center of English Language Education in Science and Engineering, which runs discipline-specific language courses for 10,000 students. And Lawrence is also well known for AntConc. A lot of you must have used it for different languages, which is actually a very interesting tool. So today, Lawrence is going to talk about vocabulary profiling of low-resource languages. He's going to talk about insights and challenges. So I'm going to stop talking and hand over back to Lawrence, who will take us into this journey on an exciting talk. And I'm going to mute Lawrence, but if you need me, just please let me know.
Okay, and if you see any questions in the chat that feel relevant, maybe at the end we can have a sort of say 5 minutes or so for questions. If you could field them there. And if there's any sound problem, just call out and we can figure it out at the time.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for that. Okay. And we can see your screen just in case.
Great.
Good.
Okay, well, let me start then. So thank you very much for inviting me to be the first keynote speaker at this first workshop on readability of low-resource languages. I think the topic is extremely important, and it's been one of my passions right the way through my career to support non-English language analysis. So I'm very, very happy to be the keynote speaker today. And as you can see on the screen here, I'm going to be talking today about vocabulary profiling of low-resource languages and give you some of the insights that I've gathered over my time. I've been doing this again for over 30 years now, and talk about some of the challenges of vocabulary profiling when it's applied to non-English languages. Talking to Karim yesterday, he said that maybe some of the presenters and the audience members may not be so familiar with vocabulary profiling as a field. Readability tends to be focused more on the equations and statistics that Mo just introduced. So I'm going to walk through what vocabulary profiling is, why it's important, how it relates to readability. And I should say that even though maybe some people might not have heard of it so much, it's probably the most commonly used method for measuring readability of commercial material, especially in language learning. Right across Asia, many students are learning English as a foreign language, and there's many textbooks designed for them. And when people write textbooks or write extensive readers, they're probably going to be using vocabulary profiling to decide the content of those books. So it's a very, very important way of measuring readability, and I'll talk about that today and the challenges that we have when we try and apply these methods to low-resource languages. Okay, so let me start by just saying a special thanks to Natalie Finlayson, who is one of my colleagues on the project that I'll be talking about later. She helped me create some of the slides describing the software, so very much appreciated her work there. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about basic concepts in vocabulary profiling, coming right back to kind of language learning in some sense, about what the 4 pillars of course design are and how they relate to vocabulary needs, language and learning objectives. Then I'll talk about the challenges of vocabulary profiling for low-resource languages in terms of the resources that are available, the tools that we have available, and even coming right down to the very basic problem of what is a word when we're not talking about English. So there's this word list dilemma that's created because defining a word becomes problematic. And then I'm going to finish the talk by introducing a solution to some of these challenges in the form of a new tool called Multilingual Profiler, which was developed as part of the National Center for NSAP. I'll explain NSAP later. But it's a multilingual profiler for Spanish, German, and French. And I'll show you how it works and how that offers suggestions for future developments in this field. Okay, so let's start with some basic concepts. some of you will know all of this, so if you do, I'm very sorry, but maybe if you don't, I hope this will be interesting. So I'm going to talk about I'll start with the 4 pillars of course design. So if we're thinking about developing any kind of materials, then we need to think about like what are the learning goals and so on. And I'm going to use the model that I introduced in this book called Introducing English for Specific Purposes back in 2018. I won't go into the details of the book, but it does introduce this 4 pillars model, which I'll show you on this next screen. So when we're designing any kind of course or program, whether it's English language learning, French language learning, even science or engineering, we really need to think about these 4 basic pillars. So the first is needs. So who are we teaching? Who is using the materials? Who is going to be studying? Where are they studying? When are they studying? Why are they studying? Once we know who we are dealing with, we can think about the language and learning objectives. So what do we teach them? What do they learn? Now, this doesn't have to be in a classroom setting. It could also be independent learning. It could just be an application for consumers and customers and users. But once we know what we want to be delivering to the client, whether it's a student or a researcher, then we have to think about the materials and methods to do that. And then finally, evaluation is how well are we actually doing that? How well are we achieving the goals of the tool, of the program, of the course, and does it meet the needs of the user? So in terms of vocabulary, let's put this into the framework of vocabulary now. So what are the vocabulary needs of our target audience? Well, the question first is, who is the target audience? So when I'm developing my software tools, it's generally for language learners of English in a non-English setting. So English is a foreign language, but it could be somebody else. So I need to think, okay, where are they, when are they, and why are they studying vocabulary? And then the 3 key questions are: what vocabulary do the learners already know? What vocabulary do learners lack? Do they not know? And what do they want to learn? So these are the kind of needs that we need to think when we're creating any kind of material. This is before we even look at readability. We need to think, who are we dealing with? What do they know? What don't they know? And what do they want to know? The next step then is to think about the language and learning objectives then. So in terms of vocabulary, for this target audience, what vocabulary is easy for them to learn? Or maybe they already know it and they don't need to learn it at all. They already know it. So what is easy to learn and what vocabulary is difficult to learn? And when we talk about readability, that means difficult to read, difficult to understand, comprehend, and so on. So once we know who we're talking about, then we can start thinking about what vocabulary we need to focus on. Now, at the next stage, we need to then think about the methods that we use. How should vocabulary be taught or learned and assessed? And this is where we start looking at extensive readers and so on. And that's where readability really does come in. And then the final step is vocabulary evaluation. So how many words have been learned by the learner in terms of breadth and also in terms of depth? How well have the words been learned? Does the learner know what the words mean? Do they know how they're used in context? Can they actually produce the words themselves? Do they know how they sound and how they're spelled and so on? Now, today, I'm not going to be focusing on materials, methods, or evaluation. Really, I'm going to focus on the needs and then these objectives that we can then look at when we think about readability. In a non-English setting, I should focus on as well. Now, in terms of vocabulary needs, there's a huge amount of research done in English, surprise, surprise, which is why it's so important to have this workshop today. So in English, if you think about the needs of a learner, well, the first question is how many words are there that they could possibly learn? How many words are in English? And Payak in 2006 said for English, there's about 988,000 words. But then we have research from Nation and Waring in 1997 saying, well, in the Webster's Third International Dictionary, there's actually only 54,000 words, but he talks about word families. Now, I'll talk about what a word family is in a moment, but it's basically a head word and its inflections or derivations. So go would be counted with going, goes, and even went, which is a question. So if you just think of individual word items, then maybe we have this PIAC 988,000 list. But if we think about families, then the number of words decreases. Okay, so that's how many words there are in English, but how many words does a native speaker know? Well, again, there's a whole lot of research about this for English. The Nation in 2001 showed that native speakers learn about 1,000 word families each year. I'll talk again about that in a moment. And then Wren in 2003 supported this by showing children of age 5 to 6 know about 2,500 to 5,000 word families. And then a graduate student, an adult, native speaker adult would know about 20,000 word families. So just let me explain what the word family is again. So if we have a list of words like aerial, aerials, aerially, aerialist, and so on, the family head word would be aerial, and then the family members would be inflectional forms or derivational forms of this head word. So we have things like run, includes run, runs, running, ran, runners, runners, and so on. A whole lot of different members of that family. And the idea is that if you know the head word, then you would know these other members. So you don't have to count them all separately. You just need to count them as a unit. Now, there are arguments that we should not be using this family member way to count words at all, and we should be using things like lemma forms, where we only include inflectional forms and non-derivational forms. And there's also the idea of a phlemma, where we have different inflectional forms, but we conflate parts of speech like nouns and verbs. So what we get is this kind of map of word counting. I'm focusing here on English, but I will come back, and of course, to non-English languages, because all of these questions become problematic when we look at non-English. So if we have a word, if we have touch, touches, touches as a verb, and so on, this would make up 10 types, 10 different words, but we could conflate them into lemmas, reducing it down to 6. So touch and touches becomes a single noun, and touches as a verb becomes a single verb. And then we could conflate the noun and verb together to get a phlemma, which would be a 5. There we have 5 items. And then we could conflate them all into a single word family and under touch and say, if you know the word touch, you know touchable, you know untouched, you know touchingly, and all the other forms. And that's what we start using as a counting unit to determine the complexity of text. We count how many of these lemmas or phlemmas or word families are in that text, and that will give us an indication of its difficulty. Now, as I said, there is an ongoing debate about this, about which is the best counting unit, and still it's debated in English. Okay, so just nearly finished this overview. So once we now know that we have this unit of counting, how many words does a non-native speaker know? That's a really important question when we're looking at readability, because if the learner doesn't know the word, then the text is going to be difficult. And we know there's a lot of research on this again for English, and the conclusion is that many adult learners of English as a foreign language know less than 5,000 word families. That's from Nation of Waring in 1997. And Charlie Brown at the bottom here, if you can, I should use my cursor here. You can see here Charlie Brown did a study and looked at the language size, the vocabulary sizes of people in different countries, and you can see it's very low. With China being 4,000, in Oman having only 2,000 vocabulary size after 1,350 hours of study. So the key point here then is that, well, for English then, we know that native speakers know, say, 20,000 word families. Non-native speakers know about 5,000 word families, so they're going to have problems when they're reading. So which words should we be focusing on? When we present a text to a learner, which words in that text are going to prove difficult to the learner? Which words in that text should we perhaps simplify or replace or delete? And that is the formation of our measure of readability in vocabulary profiling studies. So to understand now the language and learning objective, we can think about Zipf's law, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. So Zipf's law says, given a large sample of words, the frequency of any word is inversely proportional to its rank in a frequency table. Put another way, frequency times rank becomes a constant, I'll put it in terms of general English. In any corpus of natural language, whether it's English or French or German or Spanish or Japanese or Korean or Chinese, a few words will be very, very frequent in any text or corpus, and many, many words will be rare. That could be in a novel or a newspaper or a textbook or a scientific research paper. It's always the same. So as an example from English, the 10 highest ranked words in English will account for about 25% of all the words in the corpus or a text. And 50% of words in a corpus or a text will have a frequency of 1. And that's going to be then a challenge for reading, because the word only appears once in the entire book or the entire paper. Okay, so now we have the idea of Zipf's law. We can then plot this, of course, and this is a Zipfian curve for a scientific research paper. This is from English, but it would apply to any other language as well. And you can see that the very frequent words are kind of boring function words. And then in the middle layer, we have these more technical words, academic words perhaps. And then at the end, at the low frequency end, then we have technical words and difficult words and so on. So we can profile text and look at these different bands, high frequency words, mid frequency words, and low frequency words, and get an idea of if the text is difficult or easy or not. And this, of course, applies not only to a scientific paper, it applies to Harry Potter, all the Harry Potter books, and it even applies to complete 1 million word, 10 million word, 100 million word general corpora. And so this is an example of a 1 million word Brown corpus with the same Zipfian curve, with high frequency words, with covering a lot of the language, and then mid frequency and low frequency. And we can kind of conflate these results and start talking about coverage. Again, this is about English, but if we look at the first 1,000 words, it could be a word family, it could be a lemma or a phlegma, it doesn't really make a difference, but it would cover about 72% of all the words in the text. If you add the next 1,000 words, it would add an extra about 8%, and then we go down, Zipfian-like down here. Okay, so what does this mean in there? Well, Human Nation in 2001 showed that below an 80% coverage, so that would be around 2,000 word families, reading comprehension is almost impossible for English anyway. If we go to 90%, about half of learners would be able to comprehend the text without any assistance. But then at a 95% coverage, learners can read without the help of a dictionary and everything's great. So if we're trying to design textbooks or extensive readers, we want to start aiming for a vocabulary size or vocabulary size that would give the learner a 95% coverage. Now, of course, different learners have different vocabulary sizes. So different learners, once we know the vocabulary size of the learner, we can then write the books so that they would have a 95% coverage, and then the learner would be able to understand. So that's the key concept. So Paul Nation says back in 2001, it's important that learners have access to lists of high frequency and academic words and are able to obtain frequency information from dictionaries so that they know which words are easy and which words are difficult. He also says priority in teaching and learning should be given to high frequency words and words that clearly fulfill language use needs. Okay, so that's the idea. That's the whole idea of vocabulary profiling. So what does this mean for us? Well, vocabulary teachers and materials writers in universities, in publishing companies, need tools to be able to assess the vocabulary level of the materials. What coverage does a particular word list give a text? And the same teachers and material writers need tools to simplify those materials if the vocabulary level is too high. So this idea of coverage is the number we use to evaluate readability effectively. And of course, vocabulary profiling then is a primary aspect of readability assessment. In many cases, it's the only measurement of readability. We look at the vocabulary complexity, we get a coverage, and that's the score we use. Okay, so that's my introduction to vocabulary profiling. And I'll just, in case you haven't seen this before, let me just escape here and just show you what a vocab profile looks like for English, but I'll come to other languages later. So here's the software tool called Ant Profiler. And in this tool, I can profile text. So I'm just going to drag in. I hope you can all see this. This is the abstract that I used for this workshop. Okay, I'll bump up the size of the font so you can all see that. So this is the abstract that I've submitted for this workshop. And on the left here, you can see that we have 3 word lists covering the first 2,000 word families of general English and another list of 570 academic words. So let's assume that the learner knows all of these words. They know general English and they know some academic words. Would they be able to understand this abstract? Well, no, they wouldn't. And we know that because if you look at the orange words, these words are all not in the list. They're basically outside the level of the learner. And if we look at the total percentage, it may be difficult to see here, but it's 86% coverage using those 3 lists. So that means it's below that 95% level. The learner would not be able to understand this abstract without a dictionary. Now, what we could do, of course, is start looking at these difficult words and simplifying them. For example, one of the most transparent and effective ways to assess readability, well, let's say clear. How about clear? One of the most clear and effective ways, we can reprofile that. I'll just resize it, like that. Now you can see clear is within the word list, and so that percentage is slightly increased now. So this text is slightly easier than before. And authors and textbook writers and even examination writers can go through their language, simplify the text and check on the coverage and then decide it's okay or not. And that's the measure of readability that a lot of people are using. Now, of course, today we're going to hear about other ways to measure readability, which hopefully can, add to this approach and give us some better scores. But that's the idea. Okay. Just if you want to see, we can also see which of the words are in which levels. And if I do that, you can see that these blue words are academic words like text, research, challenge, concept, demonstrate, and so on. Okay, so let's come back to the presentation. Second. Okay. Oh, sorry, just a moment. Let me just jump back to that slide. Second. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. There we go. Okay, so that is the basic understanding of vocabulary profiling. So what are the challenges that we face when trying to do that same task with low resource languages? And I think maybe some of you can already predict what they are, but I want to summarize them today. So in a book I wrote back in 2019, I looked at all the resources available for researching vocabulary and published it in this Root-Lit handbook. And basically, almost all resources are centered on English, as we can kind of imagine. So one of the first real challenges is that there are lots of materials and so on for English, but not for other languages. For example, for doing vocabulary profiling, we need vocabulary lists. As I just showed you, we have this general list of English. We have these base word lists or JASIT 8,000 lists, all these different general English lists. We have academic lists. We have technical lists of English. That's all great if you want to profile English, but what about Spanish or German or some other language? Well, I did a quick check because I didn't think there was much around. And so this is what I found. I went online and typed general service list for Spanish. And I got this nice link, looks good, SpanishDictionary.com vocabulary general service list. I opened the page and here is somebody's creation, 23 words by Meg3937. Not exactly 2,000 word families like we have in English, it's just 23 useful words for Spanish. I did the same for Japanese and tried to find a general service list for Japanese, and we get lots of hits, you can see here, with Japanese, but this is, unsurprisingly, the English general service list which I just introduced a few moments ago, but with Japanese translations. So no, that's not what we want. That's for learners of English. What about learners of Japanese? What should be the general words that we need for Japanese? And I searched more. Maybe I needed to search in Japanese, so I did a search in Japanese for the same kind of list. And again, I see GSL, General Service List, in this book, but it's all about learning English. So we have real problem with resources for profiling because the list itself doesn't exist. There are many tools for vocabulary profiling. I've just there's some online tools like Vocab Profiler, this online graded text editor, the new GSL Profiler. But again, these are all for English. There are also offline tools like Range and Antword Profiler, and again, they're all English based. Okay, which is really, really disappointing because then researchers, teachers, publishers don't have materials, they don't have the tools or the lists that they can use to profile other languages. These are the two offline tools that I just mentioned, Range and Antword Profiler. And I should say, Antword Profiler does actually work with non-English text. Let me just focus on that now. So this is a freeware profiling and simplification tool that I created. I just demonstrated a few moments ago. It is completely international in its design. It can work with any language, left to right, right to left, and so on. I've just got a summary of the features here. It works on Windows, Mac, and Linux. It supports any word list of any family list. It supports any Unicode supported language with left to right and right to left language support. And it has these different statistics and editing features and so on. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is Antword Profiler needs lists that it can then profile text against. And well-established lists of general words, academic words, technical words are very, very lacking in many fields, for many languages. So even though the software is there isn't the list that we can use. Okay, and there's another dilemma as well. I'll just talk about this briefly. So when we think about LOTE, languages other than English, what unit of counting should we be using? I've just talked about types and lemmas and flemmas and word families. But so even with English, research on which is the appropriate counting unit is very, very undecided. Stokel, for example, et al. In 2020 strongly argues for lemmas or flemmas, and they claim that lemma forms would likely be known by a language learner, that a derivational form would not be known. And so don't use word families, you should be using a lemma or flemma. Whereas Webb says suggests the opposite, and that he supports family-based counting because learners' lack of knowledge of derivational forms is overstated. And he would claim that maybe they do know quite a lot of derivational forms, so we should be counting these coverage scores should be based on word families. Well, what about LOTE? Should we be using lemmas, flemmas? Do learners know the lemmas but not know the derivational forms? Well, let's have a look. So in French, so let's start with Spanish. So look at Spanish here. So for a word like touch in English, we only have a couple of inflections for this verb form. But in Spanish, there's a huge number of different forms that this verb could take, and some of them diverge quite severely away from the base form, which is toca. So we have like toque and toque. I don't know Spanish, excuse my pronunciation, but you can see these words are nothing like the base form. So why would learners be able to recognize these if they knew the head word? So learners maybe they're overestimating the knowledge of the learner. We have the same for French. This is a be verb. In English, we have some different inflections, but in French, the inflections are crazy. They're so different. So for être, we can see here, some of the inflectional forms are things like fut and soit and suis. It's completely different. We also have the same thing when we look at German. So these are determiners, nouns, and adjectives compared with against English forms. With English, we just have a and an, but in German, we have all these different forms. Same with book, and the same with big. So lemma forms are a huge problem. We can't just assume the learner would know them, which also means, to repeat, we can't just count them all as the same thing. And what about derivational forms? Do the learners not know the derivational forms? Well, in French and German and Spanish, derivational forms can be very frequent, productive, and predictable and regular. So if you know the word du, for example, the derived form du sim is probably known. And we have the same with Montag in German, goes to Montags, and libro, librito in Spanish. So knowing the derivational form would probably give you a strong hint for what the derived form means, which means then you could count them together in a group. So counting units are still not known for these different languages. What counting unit is best is still an unanswered question. So of course, if we don't know what we're supposed to be counting, then how to count and what tools to use to count becomes a massive problem as well. And this leads me to the software tool that we created. So I've been working with the University of York to create a vocabulary profiling tool for modern foreign languages. So let me briefly talk about the goals of this, the NCELP project, and then the tool itself, and then some future developments. So NCELP is the National Centre for Excellence for Language Pedagogy. It was funded by the UK Department of Education and the University of York between 2018 and 2023. And it was created or got funded so that it could implement recommendations of the Teaching School Council's Modern Foreign Language Pedagogy Review. So the government created some recommendations for French, German, and Spanish, and the NCELP project was to implement these recommendations and apply them in 45 secondary schools across England. The project will also aim to provide a searchable database of free, research-informed and classroom-ready resources for these three languages across things like phonics, vocabulary, and grammar. It was also, one of its aims was to develop new word lists for awarding organizations of the GCSE examinations. So these are creations of new lists that we could put into AntWord Profiler and other tools, again, for French, German, and Spanish. And finally, to develop an online vocabulary profiling tool to support the selection and creation of text for the study of languages other than English, including French, German, and Spanish at different levels. So the tool I'm going to show you today was originally built just for French, German, and Spanish, but the idea is to expand it into for the profiling of other languages as well. So this is what the software looks like. This is an online tool, and you can see it's got different tabs here for things like profiling, looking at the word families, and then some FAQ and about information. But the idea is that you select a list type, which has been pre-created by the NCELP group, and then you can post in a text. This could be an examination. It could be a textbook exercise. It could be a textbook even. And then you can profile this text, just as we did before for English, and then look at the coverage of this text based on the list that we give it and determine if that text is easy or difficult. So as an example here, just before I show you the example, let me just give you a summary of what it can do. So it's a free tool available at this website. It supports a dictionary list, so lists of words from dictionaries. It also supports this NCELP syllabus list. And so the NCELP created an example curriculum for language learning, which you can use with this. And then we've got these GCSE lists, and also you can upload your own custom list and extend all of them with your own custom words. It supports French, German, and Spanish, but hopefully, if you're interested, we can think of adding other languages to this. And it gives some statistics on coverage and type token, word level type token coverage, word family level type token coverage. And as I said before, you can edit you can paste in text and edit them and simplify them and reprofile them and see what the coverage changes and so on. And they export all the results. Okay, so let me give you a quick demo. I'll do it on slides here to save time. So the default setting is to use flemmas, which is basically inflectional forms conflated across parts of speech. So if we load in a text, and here's a French text, and we're using a dictionary list of 2,000 words, and we're choosing all, no inflectional forms are selected, no derived forms, we're just using the standard list. And we get here a coverage of 92% or 92.9%, 93% coverage, which is pretty good, which means that this text would probably be readable or understandable for people at this 2,000 word level in French. But maybe they don't know all the inflections and derivations, as I just talked about. So what we can also do is operate the tool with partial flemmas. So we can create a bespoke unit of a kind of cross between type and lemma. And here you can see that 3 forms of inflection are deselected. So we're going to assume that the user doesn't know all the inflections of a particular word, and we're going to reduce it down to the ones that they might know better than others. And if we do that, of course, the number of words now is dropped, and of course, then the coverage that we see there, and the coverage then drops way below the 93%. And now the text is a little bit difficult for the learner, and we might think about simplifying it or changing the words and so on. We could go the other way and create partial word families. So with this example, we have a unit of counting between type and word family. So you can see that we've got 3 inflected forms are unselected. So we assume they don't know those. And then we're also going to add derivational forms that we expect that they would know. So the im, and the ment, ament, ement forms in French, which are pretty easy to understand, and you can guess the meanings even with these derivational forms. If we do that, then the coverage slightly increases, just slightly increases here. But Finlayson is going to be publishing a paper soon that shows that generally, when you have this partial word family, there's usually a slight increase in coverage compared to a raw flemma form. Okay, so just a moment. Okay, I'm looking at the time. I think we're okay. I'll briefly talk about this. We can also do other things like we can edit these word lists by adding hyphenated words and adding words with apostrophes and so on. And of course, this will then dramatically change the results. So we can create custom lists, basically. We can also introduce exceptions to these rules. And we can even add multi-word units to the software. So not only are we counting then words, we're also counting multi-word units, and we can export these as an Excel table if you want to look at this in more detail. Okay, nearly finished. Okay, so what are the future developments of these tools? So in terms of Multiling Profiler, the first thing we want to do is add more options for these bespoke families. So we can basically create custom lists effectively, or custom modified lists that based on the frequency bands that we want to look at, maybe crossing bands. So not just 1,000 or 2,000, maybe kind of 1,500 or maybe between 500 and 1,500 and so on. We want to be able to offer more options with derivational affixes. We certainly want to add more languages, so collaborators are welcome there. We also want to add an inbuilt pos tagger, so we can do true lemma counting. And also, at the moment, the tool works with single text, but we're also interested in allowing the profiling of multiple texts, as AntWord Profiler can do. So add multiple texts and then profile them all and get some statistics on the whole set of texts. Which leads me on to the future developments of AntWord Profiler. So here we're looking to include many of these features that we added to Multiling Profiler, especially this modified inflectional and derivational form approach. Again, I want to add an inbuilt pos tagger, and hopefully today we can start this idea of including new lists for languages other than English. So I've just got a minute left, and before the Q&A, so let me just give you the conclusions. So vocabulary profiling methods provide insights on text complexity, usability in the classroom, and suitability for target language goals like extensive reading, examinations, and so on. There are lots of tools and resources available for English vocabulary profiling, but very few tools and resources available for languages other than English. So that's one problem. And in the vocabulary profiling research, most discussions in most of the literature are focused on English. Questions about what is a word, what are the coverage boundaries, what's the unit of counting, and all these questions. It's all focused on English. There's little to no research on basic principles of vocabulary profiling for languages other than English. How many words are there in the language? We don't know. What vocabulary sizes do native speakers have? We don't know. What coverage sizes are suitable for comprehension without a dictionary? In English, we have this 95%, sometimes 98%, but for other languages, we don't know. So, and this is a call for research, but researchers on languages other than English have the potential to make major contributions to the field of vocabulary and language processing in general. So if you are interested in vocabulary profiling, please do start. It's a great area of research, has massive implications, practical implications. It's used by commercial companies. You can get consulting work if you're interested. There's a lot of interest in this area, so please think about it. And I will finish there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lawrence. That's really exciting and interesting. So thanks a lot. So the vocabulary profiling stuff was quite interesting for me, especially the tool that you showed us about like how words actually that might have been a bit difficult for the audience will pop up. And I quite like the focus on other languages. And as I said, there's a big focus on English, and that is obvious. Like it's nearly everything was done in English. Even the formulas at the beginning were focused on English, and everything after that was like individual efforts.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
I can see some questions. We got a raised hand there, but there's also a question in the chat. So I'm going to read that for the recording. So the question says, does a learner's native language influence vocabulary profiling? And it says, for instance, if vocabulary items are conjugates into two languages, then maybe understanding would be higher word frequency.
That's an absolutely excellent question. So there's been a lot of discussion about how we create these lists. And one of the projects, a big project I've worked on quite recently with the British Council, was creating a knowledge-based list. So not based on just frequencies, but actually asking people, do you know this word or not? And we did this for different languages. And the book is coming out soon actually on this. But yes, it does matter. It does make a big difference. If you are a Chinese speaker, for example, compared with a German speaker, there are going to be cognates, a lot more cognates in German when you're trying to understand English, for example. And so, yes, it makes a big difference. And it's actually a very new area of work looking at knowledge-based frequency lists, not just knowledge-based lists, not just frequency lists. Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a very interesting area of research right now. And we still don't know what it is, even for English. We don't know the influence of the mother tongue, even for English. For Lot, we have no idea at all.
Thanks, Lawrence. So we've got also a question from Mohammed Al Khalil. So I'm going to make you as a presenter, Mohammed, so you can ask your question directly if you want. Should be able to now.
Natalie is in the room, I see. Natalie, it's nice to see you there. Let's wait for this question first.
Right, so I don't think, I can see like a raised hand. I don't know if Mohammed is going to ask a question.
So I'll just repeat what Natalie is just saying about with multi-link profile. With multi-link profiler, we can also add cognates to an extended list and kind of modify the pre-built list. So there's ways to adapt to different language there. But the real question is, we still don't know what influence the mother tongue has on the understanding of a foreign language.
Oh, there is.
Oh, here we are.
Okay. I haven't used this. I'm used to Zoom, so I had to find my way around this.
No problem.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, and thank you, Mohammed, for bringing us together on this. Quickly, I understand you're talking about vocabulary profiling. You defined readability in this case on lexical level, right? You did
Yes.
not. You did not include any syntactic features
Right.
in it at all.
Yep, that's
Okay.
right.
Okay.
Yep.
That was, just the one of, so in cases where words had to connect in collocations or associations or phrasal structures, have you dealt with those, like phrasal verbs?
Well, this is an interesting question. Multi-word, it's a very interesting area of work as well.
Yeah.
So vocabulary profiling, certainly to date, has almost been solely on single word items.
Yes.
Almost nothing on multi-word units. Now, there's some argument why that's actually the way to go. And counting multi-word units becomes very problematic, and even defining what a multi-word unit is becomes very difficult. And because if you know one word, you also know the other word, there's a lot of influence of words with other words. So like go down and go up and go through, are they three different words, or are they just go? Are they just variations of go? And that's this debate. And people have been debating this for a long time in English. But again, what about languages other than English? People have not even started looking at this area of work. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, it's a great area of work to look at. And just to add, because I speak Japanese, and Japanese is very interesting because there's no spaces between words. In fact, the concept of word becomes very problematic in Japanese. Everything's a multi-word unit effectively in Japanese. So again, where do we even start with vocabulary profiling when it comes to Japanese? And we do have ways to do it, but it's still debatable.
Thanks, Lawrence. Thanks, Mohammed. So one final question in the chat just before we move into the next talk, because we keep in Violetta waiting. So Abdul Karim is asking, is there any research done on the change of vocabulary over time? So he was asking if, like older generation, readability differs from what that children use nowadays.
Yeah, great question again. And I introduced a little bit of that research already for English. So there's been a lot of coverage studies for English. We know how many words a baby learns and how many words they know at 2 years old and 5 years old and 8 years old and 10 years old and 20 years old. And there's all these different tools and techniques to measure that vocabulary. For example, I created the picture vocabulary size test with Paul Nation. That was designed originally for English. But in theory, we can use it for other languages because there's no words presented on the screen. It's actually just photographs. And do you know what the photograph is representing? But again, for English, it's a lot of work, but for other languages, it's just at the very beginning.
Thanks a lot, Lawrence. I think we can stop here. But as I said, during the lunch break, if the speaker is still online, feel free to chat to them here, and we can maybe unmute you to have like a discussion with them. Thanks a lot, Lawrence. Very interesting.
Thank you very much. And I'll just repeat my thanks to Natalie Finlayson, who's in the room there. And she did help a lot. It's basically the MLP project is her project, and I've been supporting her work on that. So thank you, Natalie, for all your help on that.
Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you, everybody.
Good. So next speaker. So Violetta, if you want to turn your camera on and maybe share your screen.
Hi, I'm here. Yes. Can you see me?
Yes.
And
I can hear.
Let me share my screen.
Sure. Yeah, we can see your screen as well.
Okay.
All right, so I'll do the introduction. So thanks a lot. So we've got Professor Violetta Cavalli-Sforza, so I hope I pronounced that correctly, professor at Al-Qawain University of Computer Science, and she taught there since 2008. She has a graduate degree in civil engineering and computer science and a PhD in intelligent system studies for the University of Pittsburgh. doctoral dissertation was on computer assisted instruction for to visualize scientific arguments, and she worked on natural language processing at Carnegie Mellon University, but her research is focused on learning language through reading and dialogue, and you worked on Arabic language as well, focus on readability. So I think that will be something that you might mention today. So Violetta talk will be on what if readability assessment actually considered the reader's needs. So Violetta, you've got the stage, and we'll be here in case if you have any questions or if your screen goes off like that. I think she'll be back. That was actually perfect timing. Let me see if Violetta. Oh, I think she lost connection. We'll give her a minute or two for her to come back. So for those who joined us, you can see the program in the chat. So the link, if you scroll up, will be up there. So you've got Violetta's talk, then we're going to have a coffee break.
I am so sorry. Something really weird happened there.
That's totally fine. So I've introduced you and the talk. So whenever you're ready, please go ahead. But we'll be here to assist you if you need anything.
Just, yeah. No. Okay. Can you see that? Okay, yes. That's great. Okay, so as I was saying, thank you for the question, Dr. Khalid. It is a lead-in into my talk. I want to premise this talk by actually thanking the organizers for inviting me. Readability is a subject that's been really dear to me for many years, even though in the last couple of them I've done less work on it than before, largely because of changing roles at my institution. But I really appreciate this time, this opportunity to think about it. And what I've chosen to do here is not so much to give a talk about work that I have done, although I will touch on that, and work that others have done, I will touch on that as well, but sort of really as where should we be going next, or at least what is one of the directions where we should be going next. So I'm going to start out by addressing a couple of questions that I know this audience is somewhat familiar with, but I would like to stress that it is important to ask those questions. So here's kind of the outline of my talk. Why, how is readability important? Let's try to redefine it in a way that suits the direction that I'm trying to go into. What's missing in readability assessment, and even those works that have tried to address these missing aspects still have something that, in my opinion, is missing. How do we solve this problem? I propose a solution, I sketch it really. It's something that I would like to work on, and I would like to have people collaborate with me on, and consider how realistic is the proposed solution for English, but also for less resourced languages. So, and then just draw some conclusions. So, why is readability important? Well, I did a little search online, and funnily enough, I ran into this definition, or in this answer rather, to my question. And I was struck by the fact that the first thing that came up was that it influences Google ranking. This is clearly a very commercial perspective. And when I looked at the Google search listing and the order on readability definition, which is what brought up this thing, up came Oxford Languages, Cambridge Dictionary, Readable.com, Wikipedia, and other dictionaries. Now, my question to you is, what do you think, where do you think this definition came from. Anybody out there who wants to take a guess? Well, it came from readable.com. Obviously, they did a good job because they managed to get their site to be to score highly on readability and relevance in Google's engine. Now, this is a commercial perspective on readability, and it's one that's becoming increasingly important. But most of us are educators, so we probably want to take a look at the educational perspective. And so start out by saying that we learn a whole lot by reading if we can understand what we read, and that a child who's not a fluent reader by 3rd grade will have a hard time keeping up with other academic subjects. So readability attracts a lot of attention for this reason in education. Reading is one of the 4 fundamental competences targeted when learning a second or foreign language. And it's really important for learning a variety of aspects of language, such as vocabulary, as we've just heard very eloquently, syntax, and in general, language use in context. Visual learners, which is, I think the concept of visual learning comes in when you're doing reading, is actually something that may be relevant if you believe in learning styles or preferences, which is a subject that has received a fair amount of controversy around it. But visual learners do learn better, faster, and more agreeably with written materials, and that involves reading. Now, why is that? You may not believe that it actually makes a difference, but in fact, if you find a learning experience more pleasurable, then you spend more time on the task, and therefore that will probably result in more learning. Now, why reading and readability nowadays? Sometimes I ask myself, how important is reading given the focus on audio, video, and more interactive media than texts? Well, in fact, I think we can probably map to equivalent concepts to readability and legibility when we're talking about audio and video materials. So in the audio component, you have content, you need to be able to understand the content, but you also have, say, clarity and volume of sound, which would map to legibility here, as opposed to content, which maps to readability. We have a visual component, but visually presented information can also contribute to community information or can actually detract from it. So how materials are presented is not really enough, is not the only thing we need to be concerned about. We also need to be thinking about the processing, the ability to process that material. And you cannot really decouple the processing from the processor. In this case, the processor is the reader and their skills, their ability to process the information. So let's actually go on and try to redefine readability. So let's start with some classical definitions of readability. This one from George Clare in 1963 is actually basically focused on the ease of understanding or the style or comprehension due to the style of writing. Well, where is the reader in this definition? I don't see one. Here's a second one. The ease with which a reader can understand a written text. This comes from Wikipedia and it's pretty recent. And here is a rephrasing of that from an earlier paper of ours where we surveyed readability in the context of Arabic texts. And it says the ability of a text to be read and understood by its reader in an acceptable amount of time and effort. This gets a little bit more specific and the reader starts coming in, but rather generically. A better definition might be the degree to which a given class of people finds certain reading material compelling and comprehensible. And this is also an older definition. And I like it because it actually talks about a given class of people. It highlights the fact that there are different audiences. and that the material needs to be compelling, it needs to be interesting as well as comprehensible. So I'll just briefly mention readability versus legibility. In English, this distinction is made. It's not quite as clear that there are different words in other languages. In French, for example, we have lisibilité, which seems to really encompass both. So readability concerns the content of the text, which is dependent on matters such as the complexity of the vocabulary and the syntax and others. This is not a complete list. But it's not only that. There are other criteria such as the reader's knowledge, the reader's interest, and other such matters to consider. And there's legibility, which has to do with the presentation of the text, which is basically concerned with its typographic aspects, such as the font size, the line height, and so on. But again, not only, and legibility does interact with readability. And this is actually very, very clear when you look at materials that are created for younger learners or unpracticed learners. The size of the font, the type of the font may actually interfere quite a bit with the ability to scan the information, which makes the content of the text not accessible. So might this be the best definition? I like this definition very much. It deals with the success a group of readers have with a text. It talks about the sum total, including all of the interactions of all of those elements that affect that success. It talks about understanding, it talks about efficiency of processing, and it talks about interest in the material. So if you look at the factors in text readability, you have to take into consideration the reader, you have to take into consideration the text itself, and you need to take into consideration the interactions between the two. You could say, is this text appropriate to the reader? From many perspectives. Can the reader actually carry out the desired level of processing to get from the text what they need? And they may need to process the text at different levels. For example, people who teach foreign languages know that you can do reading for gist, you can do reading for detail, and those require different levels of processing. And then you might want to try to test comprehension using different types of questions. Okay, so what's missing in readability assessment? Well, for me, it's the reader. Most of the time, it's the reader that's missing. So if we look at readability formulas for English, they strictly focus on the text. And this is true whether we're looking at the really well-known older ones and the less well-known ones. All of this list here comes from the readable.com site. And as Dr. Anthony mentioned earlier, it's amazing how much people still rely on these formulas here in order to assess readability. If you go to most readability sites, this is all you find, nothing else. These formulas provide an ease or difficulty score that you need to interpret. Sometimes a larger number means it's easier, sometimes it means that the text is lower. Or they map the reader to a grade level, but a grade level is a whole year worth of learning. That's a long period of time. The skills of a reader at the start of that grade level are not the skills of the reader at the end of the grade level. So what do we do in between? Formulas that have been developed for other languages, for example, ARI or LIX, which was developed for, I think it was Swedish, follow the same pattern. So very much focused on the text. This is not a critique, this is, or a criticism rather, this is really more like an observation of how the field has gone for many years. Now, if you look at the modern approaches, what we've called in our work modern approaches, you actually have the same thing. You have, for example, if you look at my work with Hind Siddiqui or Nawal Nasiri over the last decade on Arabic, well, we were really looking at the text and trying to map the text into categories. Low, medium, high, maybe we could do a little bit better than that. That seemed to be what everybody was doing, and not always so well. Work done by many others on English, Arabic, and other languages follows the same suit. It was all about extracting features from the text, standard surface features, lexical features, syntactic features, in languages such as English that are very resource rich. You have cohesion features and other discourse features, less so in less resource languages. And in all of this work, readers only really appear as a category to which they're best matched. Can they handle easy, medium, or hard text? Can they handle texts that are appropriate for grade N? Now, today, you try to submit something to a natural language processing conference, and the first question you get asked is, why didn't you try using a deep learning approach? Some of you may have received this response in the past when submitting papers. And so here we're dealing with the need for lots and lots of data and lots of computing power, which is becoming actually an environmental and sustainability issue these days. But you can get good performance with deep learning approaches for many tasks if you have access to all of that. One advantage people say is no feature engineering. You don't actually have to extract all of those features. The system does it all by itself. The disadvantage is that you have no or low explainability. Why is the answer that you're getting? Why are you getting that answer? And then I ask myself, can these systems actually help me rewrite my text for better readability? How are they useful? And the only answer I give myself is, no, they're not useful. They're only useful for generate or find some kind of text and test. Okay, so that could actually be a fairly arduous process. There are some notable and some not so notable exceptions. The system REAP, which was developed at Carnegie Mellon University, primarily for English and later extended to Portuguese, is one. And I mention it here because it actually was a very strong intellectual influence on the very first study on Arabic that I was involved in. The iStart system developed at, I think it was Vanderbilt. The Lexile framework for English and ReaderBench is a system that's been in existence for a couple of years and works for English and French. And I think they may be adding some more languages to that. So let me take a quick look at some of these systems and how they address the reader. So the REAP project lasted for about 10 years. It used a large corpus of web documents. It was actually quite tied to information retrieval. One of the researchers working on it was an information retrieval researcher. It used a curriculum model representing each level of the curriculum, which in this case was a school grade, as a histogram of words. It was actually a unigram language model that was extended by annotating each word with a part of speech. It used a document model, which used a readability score, but not using the standard formulas, but based on multiple statistical language models, which was used because basically it outperformed other readability measures on web and very short documents. So many times the documents you find on the web are shorter than 100 words, and many of the other readability assessment methods, formulas essentially don't work so well when you have short documents. And they basically stated in this work that grade level of document is only one criterion. And another important one is finding a document that has a certain percentage of new words, because you're trying to get the learner to learn new words by using them and seeing them used in context. So in their case, they use two models of the learner. One was a passive model, which included all of the words that the student had actually been exposed to. So it was an exposure model. And an active model, which was all the words for which the student had demonstrated knowledge by responding to questions. And those words were also annotated for part of speech. The annotation for part of speech was meant to deal with ambiguity, particularly when a word appears and it could be a verb or a noun. And then they were interested also, they also tried to model teacher input, what the kind of choices that a teacher would make with respect to choosing a text, and student interest in the topic. Claiming that topic models could actually be built on the fly with just a few documents known to fit the topic. Now, that work inspired our work. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time in this. I want to mention that we basically looked at a corpus that I had access to because I had worked on a project that used this textbook, El-Kitab fi Ta'allum al-Arabiya, developed by Georgetown University Press. We actually had the text typed in, analyzed, and basically usable for doing statistical studies on. And we tried to do the traditional thing, which is to train some kind of a classifier to be able to rank texts according to ideally the different chapters of the book, which we took to be different levels in the curriculum. I should mention these, it was actually 25 chapters. It was 20 chapters from volume 1 and then 5 chapters from volume 2, which was considered an intermediate level. Then the book was rearranged. We separated the chapters into different chunks in the later editions of the book. And of course, we did well if we just evaluated how our model did when tested on the same data on which it was trained. Well, we did okay on 3 and 5 level classifications, i.e. not on the 25 chapter classification. And then we used a model also to try to predict whether unseen text, different kinds of unseen texts, could be mapped well to the upper 5 levels of the curriculum. And we had Arabic instructors evaluate that, and we got some good results and some good input about how to improve that. But for me, the really interesting part of the study, even though the study was an early one, and if I were to go back, I'd do a lot of things differently, was that we actually asked questions about how much new vocabulary were those students expected to learn at each chapter or level. And did this number of new words actually change through the curriculum? In other words, what was the effort that was expected from the perspective of vocabulary for the learner? And we got some answers to those questions. Now, there's more detail in this figure than I actually want to talk about, but we looked at different types of words. So targeted words are basically the ones that you would like the student to learn. These are words that are explicitly mentioned at the beginning of the chapter, and that you're expecting the student will pick up and will learn about at the end of this chapter when they complete the chapter. Okay, and if you look at those lines, we did the analysis both for types and for tokens. It's a fairly high percentage of the total number of types or tokens in the chapter near the beginning, and that's not surprising because a student is basically getting introduced to the language in the first few chapters. But then it kind of stabilizes to a value that's not usually higher than 10%. Okay. On the other hand, if you look at the other data, you see that the number of words that the student are supposed to know as they appear in the text increases, and that makes sense. And the number of words that a student will not know will tend to decrease, and that's expected too, because the student is actually learning vocabulary for this language. The other question that we were asking was how much new vocabulary were students expected to learn, and how did that change at the level? Sorry, I think there may be an issue up here. So if you look at that number stays fairly low, not much higher than 50%, around until in the first half of the, say, volume 1, and then it kind of starts rising in the later chapters, and then it kind of bounces back up and it stays there. Okay, so I don't know, I'm not a language teacher, I'm not an Arabic teacher, but to me, when I say I need to be learning 100 new words in this chapter, or 140 or 50 new words, that is a lot of learning to do. So that was for me an interesting first look at vocabulary learning and text comprehension through vocabulary. Let me go beyond this work. As I said, it was early work and interesting in its kind, but also had a lot of faults in it. I'm going to jump to a very, very different and very well-known approach, which is the Lexile framework, and I won't. In fact, not a whole lot is known about how the system works because it is a commercial enterprise and a large one. But it's basically a very well known and widely used system for matching readers to texts. It's particularly used in the US school system. And basically the readers and the texts are measured on the same scale. It has received some fairly aggressive criticisms from well-known people in educational psychology. In some cases, because it steers potentially readers away from content they're interested in by, attributing to a text much higher lexiles than the reader has, according to the assessment that was done. But in other cases, it just seems to really misrepresent very, very greatly the difficulty of text, assigning very low lexile scores to texts that are actually very difficult, and vice versa. But it does take the reader into consideration. Then here I'll just move very quickly into a couple of systems that really involve the reader in the reading process. This is really moving beyond just readability assessment. They are focused on reading comprehension. They focus on strategies for reading. They focus on different ways in which you can assess that comprehension by paraphrasing, by looking at whether the reader is able to bridge the current sentence to previous material, and how does this question relate to the previous one? How does this sentence relate to the previous one? By asking the reader to predict later content, and by connecting the content of the text to personal knowledge. And so the iStart system was developed also at Vanderbilt, was looking at that. That worked, and other work that was more based on cohesion, trying to understand and characterize the cohesion of text and the discourse structure, which was represented in the sister called CoMatrix, which I'm not talking about here, was picked up by a system that you may be familiar with called ReaderBench, which also had a similar goal, which was to basically be able to perform an analysis of texts for difficulty on one side, and on the other side, try to assess the reading strategies that users were applying and how well they were applying them to assess their comprehension. And in this case, they were measuring text complexity by a variety of different features, which include lexical, morphosyntactic, semantic, discourse, and cohesion indicators. And all of these are aggregated through a support vector machine model. So again, focusing on both the learner and the text and putting the two together. So these are great systems and really a lot richer than just readability formulas and other text-oriented systems. There's still something missing from my perspective, which is giving the learner a choice as to what text to read. So we know that readability, text difficulty is a function of many factors. That some learners are just assigned text to read by the teacher. Maybe it's the text that are in the textbook. But today we're talking about lifelong and independent learners. So some learners may want to choose their text to learn specific things or to practice specific things. It may be vocabulary. We know vocabulary is extremely important. It may be particularly difficult grammatical constructions. It may be the use of some expressions that are not, don't have compositional semantics. It may be that they're looking for specific rhetorical patterns in the text. And this is kind of climbing up the difficulty of analysis level. So the questions I ask myself is, will standard readability models help the learner choose the next text to read, given where they are? And the answer is no. Maybe they will achieve some kind of a finer classification, some kind of accurate grade level, more accurate grade level, even a very accurate lexile level on many different types of texts. But can they support a reader through a year-long curriculum for school grades or an individual learning trajectory in general? And the answer there is, I think, no, again. So the problem is, when I choose the next text, how do I choose a text that matches my needs, but does not introduce so much complexity that I will not be able to understand it? Because a text could be difficult because of a combination of factors. And so my answer to that would be to try to choose the next text that I want to read based on increased difficulty of specific factors, the ones that I'm interested in, my present needs. And these are examples of factors, and they span the whole spectrum from vocabulary to genre and the use of certain kinds of discourse markers, and maybe throwing in there my actual interests, what I'm interested in learning about now, and that may change with time. So this, of course, should remind you a little bit of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. The idea here is to try to choose texts that push, sorry for the repetition, push the learner beyond the comfort boundary to learn new things, but not too much at a time. And to use the computer tool, whether it's intelligent or not so intelligent, as my kind of guide, my collaborator, the one that will help me actually navigate that zone of proximal development. So for example, suppose that I'm a learner who needs practice with the use of a newly learned tense. Maybe I would like to really select texts that contain several examples of this new tense I'm trying to learn. I may want to have in there, I will have in there some use of tenses that I'm familiar with. I may prefer a text that has no tenses that I'm not familiar with, or maybe if I can't do without that, then I should get some kind of an explanation. And of course, I should have enough vocabulary in there that I'm familiar with. And so basically, given a choice of texts that meet these criteria, which one would I choose? I would choose most likely a text that maximizes criterion 1, minimizes criterion 3, and tries to maximize criterion 4, particularly with respect to vocabulary that is relevant to the new tenses I'm trying to learn, that's being used in those tenses. So how do we solve this problem of getting the next best text? And this is where I kind of become a little visionary. I would like to create a multidimensional map of my text base. I would think of each factor of interest as a dimension. I would annotate the text for all dimensions of interest. In some cases, the label may already come with the text. The text may be labeled by topic or may be easily labelable by topic. I don't think the word exists. Other aspects may actually require me to process that text with natural language processing tools, or in some cases manually if those tools are not available. Then I would arrange text in this multidimensional map according to their value in each dimension, where this value will differ depending on the dimension. For vocabulary, it might be histograms, how many words appear that I'm familiar with. For grammar, it might be the number of occurrences of given construct, because I'll be focusing on some of those constructs in my learning. For topic, it might be a category label, much simpler. And then each text in this map will have neighbors that are annotated, and they will be annotated in each dimension. So, you might consider of me, I'm starting with text 1, and then from there I've moved to text 4. Now I want to go to the next text. And which one do I choose? Say these arrows here represent different dimensions of complexity. Do I choose to go to this text here, which will increase complexity in 2 directions, or will I choose another one, which will increase complexity in a different direction? Or maybe it would be better to represent these kind of relationships by thinking about it this way. So each text is on a continuum of increasing complexity along one dimension, but not all texts will follow the same trajectory. And so the algorithm for choosing the next text should really be to find the neighbors along each dimension of interest, to evaluate the relative suitability. It could be that one text may be the best choice on one or more dimension of interest, but it may be a very poor choice on another. So I need to do some kind of a trade-off between those. How realistic is this? Well, if you're dealing with high resource languages, I think from the perspective of annotating the text, it's feasible. And there are corpora available at different levels of difficulty. Many tools may be available for different types of annotations. I think we can say this for English with certainly with high certainty. Although the algorithm that I just mentioned may still be quite tricky to implement, will require some work and some testing. For less or low resource languages, well, you could try to use some good quality tools that translate into English and do the processing there. I have some experience working here in Morocco with students where we try to work on French. The tools available for processing French, even though French is considered a high resource language, are really not nearly as good as for English, or not nearly as easy to find. And so you can run your text through very good translators such as DeepL, which has amazing performance for English into French, and do the processing in English and then translate back what you need. You can also stay at lower levels of resources and annotation. You can, most languages will have some kind of a bilingual dictionary, or at least if you don't want to work with them computationally, you should have access to such. You might be able to develop a decent pause tagger. You might be able to have some statistical language models, even if you don't have a huge amount of text, and maybe some part-of-speech-based language models to try to capture some grammatical regularities. You might be able to leverage subword tokenization, as do many of the large language models do today, for morphology, since this will basically reduce sparseness. And you can also see what ChatGPT can do with a less resource language, because sometimes it can actually give reasonable performance. For selection by topic, you can build topic models from a small set of labeled documents by using similarity. And in general, I think tool construction and tool use can take advantage of language similarities. So these could be language similarities between languages that are similar, between a main language and its dialects, or even between dialects. Some differences between these pairs are fairly systematic at the lexical and morphosyntactic level, even at the grammatical level in some cases, and you can use those similarities to establish some mapping between the texts and help identify the differences and then work with the differences for the learning. So let me conclude here. Just a little bit over my time due to the delay I had. I think there are really two kinds of readability assessment. There's a conventional one that works with generic scores, gives relatively coarse classifications, is targeted to and requires large document collections. And then there is the more individual and adaptable one, which actually breaks down the scoring across different dimensions of complexity, supports a search for documents that says, what's the next best document given that I'm interested in practicing this particular aspect of language, and helps create an individual trajectory for each learner. We really need both. And I think that the second approach is going to become more important as we kind of exhaust what we can do with the first one. My personal next steps would be to try to implement this scheme for MSA texts. MSA is no longer a low resource language, though it's not necessarily a very high resource language. Maybe implement this for Moroccan Arabic, Darija. And then, because of personal interest and looking to the future, implement for Italian and the Venetian dialect, which is a dialect that I'm actually able to understand mostly. And I'm open to other languages that I know something about. So my question to you here is, can we collaborate? And I hope that this workshop will be an opportunity for creating more collaborations, particularly for our students here. I think they would really benefit from reaching out to other practitioners and academics in the world with respect to natural language processing and education. So thank you for listening in many languages. And do you have any questions? And I thank Merriam-Webster for allowing me unofficially to use this picture, which I find really appropriate.
Thank you very much. That is really exciting and interesting. And I really quite like the thing you mentioned at the beginning, that usually the reader is not included and all the focus is on the text. And you also mentioned that there is lack of understanding of the readability of, let's say, a student between grades, because when they start, as you said, let's say grade 4, it's not the same readability measure or score at the end of that grade. So we were interested, and we are still interested in readability for Arabic. And I will come back to you with a question after that, because we have a coffee break after this. So if people want to stay around to ask questions, that's fine. So I see like a hand raised, but there is also a question in the chat from Lawrence. So he said, I think that was a question to you. And he said, some researchers have argued that the huge success of extensive readers shows that vocabulary is the primary factor that determines readability, and that if we control for vocabulary, we don't need to worry about any of the other factors.
How do I react to that?
Yes, he said, what do you think about this position? And I think, yeah, I think you can jump in.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I think vocabulary is extremely important in many languages, okay? But there are languages where word order and grammar is complex enough where vocabulary will give you perhaps a gist of something, but maybe not very accurate even a very accurate gist. And I think Arabic is one of those languages, right? So consider, the whole problem of the Arabic text, no diacritic signs, word can be different things, word order, because of the complex grammar and morphosyntax of Arabic, depending on the position of the word, you can actually get very different meanings. So that would be one response. So yes, if you are only interested in gist, vocabulary is great. And by the way, I thank you, Dr. Anthony, because several years ago, I read that in order to be able to read a text and understand the meaning of unknown words, you needed to know somewhere around 94% of the words in the text. And I was trying to find that document again, and I couldn't find it, but you just pointed me to it.
Yes.
So, so vocabulary is of utmost importance, and I think that's why it has gotten, and it should continue to get enormous attention, with all the complexities that happen when vocabulary, when highly inflected languages, or languages with very complex derivational forms and irregularities. And I happen to be a native speaker of one of those, for the same reason that French and Spanish have those irregularities. Now,
that question came because I've heard it said amongst vocabulary researchers in English. I think it's a very English vocabulary researcher position to have. Like, vocabulary is everything, but I don't know if it really is that the case when we look at the other languages, and I guess it isn't for many, right? Mm.
But I'll come back to that maybe in the break, because it's more like a personal response. But I think that we also reading is not just for understanding. Reading has another very important purpose. Reading teaches us to write, okay? And in fact, it's very hard to separate. You cannot become a good writer without being a good reader, or without being an extensive reader. And so vocabulary is really not sufficient for writing, okay? So it's by looking at texts that you learn how to write, because you need to look at the grammar, you need to use it, you need to look at context, you need to put those pieces together, and you need to figure out what acceptable orders and the constraints that words place on each other. So, and that's particularly true for some languages, not for all languages perhaps, but certainly for languages like Arabic, like most of the Romance languages, at least the ones that I'm able to parse. So that would be my question, my answer to that question. Thank you for asking, though. Important question. And thank you for listening too.
So we've got Dr. Khalil. I have you as a presenter now if you want to. Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you, Violetta. This is very informative and enriching. And, we've been dealing with this at we had the project, the SAMA project, which you are familiar with, and we had, dealt with so many of the questions. Some of this, it brought me back to many issues. But one area that we really didn't touch, which is the, Al-Kitab, used Al-Kitab, and we had a similar experience because we used a curriculum also in the beginning of our project, the SAMA project. We used a curriculum from the UAE Ministry of Education, and we ran into issues. Now, I have a question for you about use of Al-Kitab. I have taught this actually as a teacher, so for many years, and the Al-Kitab has a premise in its design from the beginning, which there are many people who kind of agree and disagree about it, which is the use of authentic texts from early on. So if you look at the Al-Kitab, they introduced whole articles right away, picked from Al-Ahram or from Al-Sharq Al-Awsat, and they basically, even at lower levels, they ask the student to pick just the word that you know. But then these are in the text. So my question is that how that data, how did it how did it affect the information? Because the design, and there are many other issues also, like the concepts that they introduce in the units. They decide to focus on certain political, for example, events or so how did that, you see that ultimately didn't it affect the results? In our case, what we found for example, with the Ministry of that the leveling was very poor. There were almost no leveling, and we were looking to use that curriculum as a gradual leveling, sort of like a scale that we could use. We ended up ditching it completely and going another route, as Nizar probably will explain later. So, how did you deal with the design issues of the kitab, and especially the use of authentic texts in it right away?
So I think we weren't really dealing with it in the sense that the work that we did not get reflected back into action in the classroom. I'm not an Arabic teacher. Our university uses El-Kitab, as far as I know still. They don't only use El-Kitab, they've also developed their own online materials with some interaction to it. El-Kitab was at the time, and we're now talking about, gosh, 10 years ago, I mean, 10 at least 10 years ago when the study was actually presented in 2014 at the Scala conference. It was really one of the best tools on the market for if you wanted to graduate from a introductory level Arabic text to a more complex one. So for us, the interesting part was to see that there was some consistency at least a percentage of new vocabulary. There was some consistency there at each level. And it was a little scary to watch, the number of words go up so high. And yes, I think you can work with authentic text, but you probably need to give much more support, perhaps than the textbook itself was giving. It was at the time really just an on-paper text that could be changed with, say, the type of tools that were developed at the Linguistic Data Consortium, the ARET tools, which had, actually pronunciation, reading, and a lot of morphological and dictionary definitions associated using the Backwalter system. I think the problem with text is that, in general, texts keep changing, and topics keep changing, and everybody, that's a problem with a textbook in general, right? Is that what is relevant at this time, by the time the textbook gets used by a variety of locations, of schools, and through time, those texts lose relevance, or they become hard to understand because they talk about things that are no longer in people's minds. So which is why I think it's more interesting perhaps to deal with texts that are found on internet and authentic, yes, but also actual. But they need to be analyzed and simplified in some cases. Simplification is a really important field right now. But although most simplification these days basically means cut your sentences short and use well-known words instead of, abstruse synonyms. Now, to just say one thing in favor of, by the way, we did a study here on the school curriculum of Morocco for the early grades, 1 through 6. And we also found some really poor choices and poor categorization. And a larger study that was carried out by under the auspices of USAID actually showed the same thing, and it actually resulted in the textbooks being rewritten. I don't know how well the new ones have fared so far, but to say something in favor of El-Kitab is, I studied Arabic first from another textbook, and the introductory textbook was great. It was very communication oriented. I actually learned quite a bit of standard Arabic, so that when I actually went to Egypt, I could communicate in basic ways with people around me. And then there was level 2 of the textbook. And the text went from being 10 lines long to being 3 pages long and written in font that was, 1/5 the size of them. And it was just totally incomprehensible. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Yeah. Sorry, that was a really long answer too.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks.
And by the way, it's nice to see you again, virtually.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
I can't hear you. Are you muted?
I am muted. Yes, so I was just saying thanks a lot for the very interesting talk. I've got one question, then I'll pass on to Johannes because I'm sure he's waiting for his part of the workshop. So my question was just about, like, I think it also links to what Lawrence has mentioned about like vocabulary profiling. So I mean, nowadays it's different. So we've got a lot of like code switching, and we've got like loads of variations of dialects like Italian, Spanish, German, and Arabic. So how is that changing the way we should assess readability in the future?
I think so. Thank you for asking that question, and again for bringing up the issue of similar languages and cognates, as Anthony did at the end of his talk. So I think we really need to leverage the students' native language as much as possible as in our dealing with providing texts for students. I think obviously, I mean, I learned Spanish when I was was actually an adult. I was going through my PhD, and I didn't start my PhD early. I was like in my in my early 30s actually. Even though the languages are so similar, they are actually you can't just take a text in Spanish and read it and understand it. But there's a whole lot of similarity. Cognates can be milked for a lot of comprehension, but there's a whole lot of other things that you need to learn, and those are at the level of syntax, and they are at the lexical level as well. The question is particularly important here in Morocco, where not only do you have people who come from a who learn Darija at home, and then they go to school and they have to study at MSA, and there's been a whole lot of controversy about that. We also have Amazigh speaking people, and Tamazight actually has a significant amount of lexical overlap with Darija, but it is a different language altogether. And those students have a really hard time actually going to school. So, but there are bridges that could be built between the languages if one were to do it carefully. And there are some similarities even at the morphosyntactic level. They're not from the same language family, but I think we could leverage those more.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I can't remember who mentioned that in one of the conferences. It could be Nizar, but there was a discussion about like how children learning in not their own dialect, so basically not their language, and then trying to learn first to understand MSA, read an MSA, then understand the subject that they are being taught. So there's kind of like an obstacle in between what they speak and what they are trying to learn. So that might, in my understanding, kind of slow the learning process for those kids. And that's why, like, that's my question.
Yeah. Yeah, but the other thing I think we need to really work on is making reading fun, because I think a lot of the obstacle to reading is people don't read, and they read less and less. So we need to make it funner than videos.
Yeah, raiders rather than readers these days, because they just want a very short version. But thanks a lot for your time and for the exciting talk. Really appreciate that. Thank you, Violetta.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Anytime. Right, Johannes, are you there? I wonder if I have to. Oh, sorry, I didn't know that. Okay, you are there. All right. So, do you want to share your screen and then I'll do the introduction? Oh, you're muted now. Sorry, I must have done something wrong.
Oh, sorry. No, I was saying, so I can't share my screen yet. I'm still waiting for Prof's screen sharing to stop.
But I can try and share my screen, then it will kick the others out. Then I'll stop my sharing.
Thank you.
And you should now be able to, hopefully.
I stopped sharing too, so.
Oh, that. Did that fix it?
Yes, it's still coming.
I can see something happening. Yes, it is. Good. So we've got, I'm really sorry if I don't pronounce anything correctly, but we've got Johannes Sibiko from Nelson Mandela University, and he's going to talk about like really interesting language, which is Sesotho in South Africa. So please go ahead, Johannes, and we'll ask you questions after that.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Johannes Sibeko from Nelson Mandela University. So I am presenting from my current PhD project. So in my PhD project, I am trying to adapt readability metrics from English to Sesotho. In this presentation, I will quickly introduce Sesotho and then present a few orthography issues in Sesotho, and then refer to some previous studies on text readability in Sesotho, and then present my approach and the challenges that I've faced. So Sesotho is spoken mainly in Southern Africa. I list here Lesotho, South Africa, and Zimbabwe because it is an officially recognized language in the three countries. However, it is also spoken in other countries. In Lesotho, at least 92% of the people speak Sesotho, although of course the majority of the speakers are from South Africa. Normal letters in Sesotho included at least 22 of the 26 letters of the alphabet, but due to the interaction of languages, we saw an introduction of the use of letters like C, V, X, and Z into the inventory of letters in Sesotho. And then there are also 13 digraphs that are commonly used in Sesotho and 5 trigraphs. And then all this, the sounds of the 44 letters in Sesotho or South African Sesotho are taught in the elementary levels in Sesotho classes. There are more differences between South African Sesotho and Lesotho Sesotho, but I will just mention a few here that are relevant to my presentation today. So the representation of the semi-vowels in the Lesotho orthography is different to that of the South African orthography, in the sense that the Lesotho orthography will use O and E to represent the semi-vowels, while the South African orthography uses the letters W and Y. And then we also find that the South African, the Lesotho Sesotho uses the letter C to represent the ch sound, which in the South African orthography, the digraph TJ is used. And then, of course, the use of diacritics in the Lesotho orthography, which is not available in the South African orthography, and the contractions of consecutive nasals in the Lesotho orthography, which are not present in the South African orthography, and the tone marking, which is present for the Lesotho orthography and not for the South African orthography. So these issues are relevant if we want to use the traditional readability metrics, especially in terms of the syllable boundaries. So if you want to identify the syllable boundaries, then the use of the semi-vowels in the two orthographies becomes important. And if you want to measure the length of words according to the characters used, and then the use of the single letters like C and the digraphs like TJ in the South African Sesotho becomes important. There have been some previous studies on readability for Sesotho, such as the readability of Sesotho health pamphlets in 2017 and the Sesotho health literacy test in 2017. However, Sesotho and the other 9 South African official languages have been identified as under-resourced by the different human language technology edits since the year 2010. We currently have an ongoing language audit in the country, but the results are yet to be released. And the Sesotho Basic Language Resource Kit also identified the fact that Sesotho lacks the basic or the necessary digital language resources. The previous readability studies on Sesotho used manual methods, and they relied on the readability formulas in English. My PhD study then wanted to adapt the readability metrics so that they suit the specific context of Sesotho, because when the English readability formulas are used, some of them produce results that are out of boundaries. So in this presentation, I focus only on the 3 readability measures, which is the Coleman-Liao Index, the Gunning-Fogg Index, and the Dale-Chal Index. So to adapt the measures to Sesotho, we first consider the relevant text features that need to be considered in the development of the readability formulas. We note that the Coleman-Liao Index uses only text features that can be extracted using generic tools. For instance, the number of characters can be counted using a tool from non-Sesotho languages, for instance, from English. And the same holds also for the issue of sampling. Although, of course, in the end, we do not use sampling in the development of the readability formula for Sesotho. We also note that the Gunning-Fogg Index uses complex words, which are words with 3 or more syllables. As such, syllable information becomes important for us to extract from the text. All other information can then be extracted using generic tools. And then finally, we consider the Dale-Chal Index, which incorporates the use of difficult words, which are words that are uncommon in the language and are therefore expected to be unknown or unfamiliar to grade 4 learners, at least in the US. So moving over to the challenges. So the very first challenge that we faced was the fact that there was no training texts available for us to use. That is, we couldn't develop the readability measures because we did not have a corpus. So we were also unable to use texts that are leveled for readability either by previous research or by normal school grades. So we tried to get permission from the publishers to use their textbooks, but only one publisher allowed us to use Sesotho textbooks. As a result, we opted for an alternative option, which was the use of translated texts. For the translations, we relied on Google Translate because we didn't have enough funding to get professional human translators. Although, of course, we understood that Google Translate may not provide the best translations for Sesotho. As a result, we employed the use of human editors in the editing of 50% of the machine translations. So we had a total of 80 texts, and we had 40 of the texts post-edited by human translators. And then we evaluated the translations against the post-edited translations using 3 metrics: the BLEU score, the NIST score, and the RIPE score. And the evaluations, although not primarily meant to evaluate machine translations against human post-edited texts, revealed a higher similarity index for the 2 data sets. We also compared the readability levels of the machine translations and the human post-edited text. Our results indicated consistent readability levels. In this way, we had our text in Sesotho and the readability levels annotated using the English readability measures on the English translations from the Sesotho text. Unfortunately, we could not use or we could not translate from English to Sesotho, as we realized that the translations from English to Sesotho used two orthographies, the South African and the Lesotho orthography, whereas in the study, we hoped only to focus on the use of South African orthography. The second challenge was the issue of manual syllabification methods, which were used in the previous studies. As a result, we developed two syllabification systems because we couldn't rely on the manual identification of the syllabification. So we explored the two systems. First, we compiled a list of 13,055 words annotated with syllable information. To develop the list, we used the Sesotho International Dictionary, which lists words, pronunciation information, definitions, usage examples, and the English translation. We extracted the main word and the pronunciation information. We then converted the pronunciation information to syllable information for our course, and we did this manually. And then we employed the use of this list in the development of a pattern-based syllabification system and found that it performed well at a 78% accuracy rate. We then also considered the use of rules in the identification of syllable boundaries. To do this, we wrote a list of rules and developed an algorithm for the identification of syllable boundaries. The results indicated a 99% accuracy rate. As a result, we incorporate the rule-based syllabification system in our script for the Sesotho Gunning Fork Index. And the third challenge was the absence of a list of common Sesotho words. So we developed a corpus-based list of commonly used words. You can see in Sibeko and de Klerk 2023. Unfortunately, Sesotho as a low-resource language does not have much original corpora. So even previous research that reports having compiled originally written corpora for Sesotho are not open to sharing the corpora. As a result, we were not able to access that. Fortunately, even newspapers and magazine texts are translated from English and other languages to Sesotho. We were not able to locate any corpora of originally written texts in Sesotho. So because we were limited by these copyright restrictions from using literary text, we ended up targeting existing corpora from the South African Center for Digital Language Resources and the National Center for Human Language Technologies translated texts that were used for training the Achumatu translation system. Both the corpuses are sentence-aligned translations from English to all the other official languages of South Africa. We only focused on the Sesotho text. We then also explored the use of religious texts and used the Christian Bible as it had a complete segment-to-segment translation from English to Sesotho. By exploring the frequencies of the common words in all three corpora, we developed a list of 3,000 common Sesotho words. We are yet to test it on school learners, but we are hoping to do that in future work. However, it provides us with some basis for the development of the DealChart index for Sesotho. Before I conclude, so in our method, we identified the problem that there is no readability metric in Sesotho. So we collected the training text and then identified the readability levels by translating the text to English and using the English readability levels to annotate the Sesotho text. And then we aligned them to the text features and then created regression models for the different formulas. First, the Gunning Fork Index, we changed the formula a bit by introducing an intercept. that minus is 1.77916. And then while the English formula did not have an intercept, and then we also introduced a coefficient to the percentage of complex words per word, which is 30.9982. And then we moved over to the Coleman-Liao index. And then as can be seen here, we do not propose any changes to the shape of the formula. We only proposed different weights based on our on the text features in Sesotho. And then for the Dale-Chal index, we also kept the structure of the English Dale-Chal index, but also only changed the weightings for the different text features. Yeah, so I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present. I hope I made sense.
Thanks a lot, Johannes. That's actually your talk is what this workshop is about. So under resource language that struggles from the lack of data available, also like as you said, there isn't even proper data in Sesotho. There is translations. Even the newspapers that you refer to were actually translations from English. And we had similar problem because one of my students is working on Igbo language, and then the same problem Igbo has. Less resources, so we did look into Parallel Bible. So before we do have a couple of questions. So I'll ask you those, and then we'll move on to the next talk. So the first one is from Lawrence. So he said, "Why did you need to translate the text to apply the readability measures?"
So when we tried to use the English formulas to apply the readability levels to the text, we found that most of them were out of bounds. So they did not make sense. So you'd find that some texts are actually on the negative 1.2, and then others are too high. So we decided, let's first translate this to English and then measure the readability based on the English translations, and then bring it back to the Sesotho text.
Thanks,
I don't know
Johannes.
if I answered.
So we have one.
Oh,
yeah.
Can I just quickly follow up? So do you mean that you could apply it in the target language, but the measure produced an odd result, which led you to use the English version? So you could apply it, but it didn't seem to be working well. Is that right? Great, thank you.
That's right.
Thanks,
Lawrence. We've got a quick question from Subrat Mulligan. So it's actually a good question. So why those metrics in particular? So it's referring to Coleman, so CL, FOG, and DC. So the ones like you mentioned in your presentation. You can see that in the chat.
So we identified 9 readability metrics from Python's readability package. But I just thought it's too much to discuss today, so I only used these 3. So I chose the Gunning-Fogg index to represent the ones that focus on syllable-based information, and then the Coleman-Liao that focus on the word length in terms of the number of letters, and the Dale-Chal, which uses a list of common words. So I thought, let me just pick 3 and present on those ones. But in the actual thesis, we discuss 9.
Right. Well, thanks for being concise. So I'm anxious about time. So yes, it's just like a praise of the fact that many African languages are actually under-resourced and underrepresented in a lot of NLP research, and that's exactly the whole idea of this workshop. All right, thanks a lot, Johannes, and we're going to move on for the next talk. So I think we have Nizar as the speaker. Yeah, so if you can stop sharing screen, Johannes. That's gone. Good. So the next talk is by Nizar Habash, and then the team actually includes Mohammed Khalil, Hind Siddiqui, and then Sinjak Jan and Reem Hazem and Bashar Hapni. And then the title of this abstract is Arabic Automatic Readability Resource in the SAMR project. So the stage is yours, and I'll go mute just to give you the chance to speak.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah, and I can hear you fine.
Great. Thanks, Mo, and also Hind and the rest of the team organizing this workshop. It's quite impressive to see over 40 people attending. Thank you all for coming. So I'll be talking about this project, SAMR project, and some of you already met my colleague Mohammed Khalil, who asked a few questions earlier. And this is work done at New York University, Abu Dhabi. It was funded by an NYU Abu Dhabi Research Enhancement Fund. Our main objective for this project, which officially has ended actually, so I'll be producing basically the results of this effort that went on for almost 4 years, was the develop standards and tools for simplification of modern fiction in Arabic to school-age children. Tied into that, of course, is the problem of readability assessment and determination. And specifically, the goal of this talk is just to introduce to you the project and also some of the resources that we have created, hopefully so that you may be inspired to use them or build on top of them, etc. At the top, there is the QR code and the link also for the website for the project that has the links to all of these resources, and I will put a copy of my slides there later today, so you can have access, to the slide themselves. All right, but before I start, I know a few of you have mentioned Arabic a couple of times, and maybe not everybody is familiar with the complexities of Arabic, so I'm just going to try to do a quick couple of minutes, maybe more than a couple of minutes, but review of Arabic. And for Arabic today is not one of the low resource languages exactly as it used to be maybe about 20 years ago when I started working in this field, but it remains to be one of the top 10 languages in the world with about 400 million speakers living across 23 different states. And it's also the liturgical language, classical Arabic in that former Quranic Arabic, for almost 2 billion Muslims. But it's important to kind of point out, tied into this complexity of readability and reading Arabic, is that neither classical Arabic or Quranic Arabic specifically, nor standard Arabic today is actually native languages of anybody. So the question of reading those texts is kind of more complicated because of this linguistic difference between the people who actually want to use and read this language and the texts that are created in it. Now, also independently from a natural language processing point of view, Arabic has a combination of interesting challenges, and these are morphological richness, orthographic ambiguity, and dialectal variations, which I will hint at next. Because they were actually very relevant in many of the design decisions that we did in the SAMR project. So Arabic is morphologically rich in the sense that when you talk about a particular lemma, thanks for the speaker earlier, Anthony, who actually introduced some of these ideas, so I don't have to get into them as much. Arabic, by the way, can get up to thousands of forms because it's not just prefixations and suffixations of features like gender, number, aspect, mood, etc., but also because of clitics that attach. So you could have a single word like this one that has 5 different elements, morphemes inside of it. In comparison to an English verb, it's about 6, and for Chinese is 1. So this adds another layer of complexity to, what does it mean to know a word, and what does it mean to read that word? Additionally, as was pointed out by Professor Cavalli-Sforza, there's the problem of orthographic ambiguity, and that's because Arabic uses diacritical marks optionally for proficient readers, children. And in religious texts, those are usually provided almost fully, but in newspapers, it's less than 2% of the time of the words do we actually see diacritical marks. So when you see a word like the one that appears on the screen here, it could actually have 3 among many, actually, there's a lot more readings, but this one that are kind of distinct. So it would be like a wali'ina, wali'ainin, and wala'inun, and you get 3 different interpretations that are quite varied from each other. And basically that connects also different ways of interaction between affixations and clitics. And here I kind of highlighted in red the parts that I would call the lamata or the base words in this particular case. This is a simplified example, by the way. There are, of course, luckily, lots of tools that have been developed over the years that help process this text in context to determine the proper form. This is just a plugin for one of our tools, Camelira, that does this. I'm happy to kind of talk about it more if any questions come up. Third is the problem of dialectal variation. And, as I mentioned earlier, there's, of course, classical Arabic that we talk about, but also modern standard Arabic, which is the official language of governments, education, media. And then the dialects are the predominantly spoken forms, now actually more written in social media. And how is this relevant to the context of readability? Well, it's relevant in the sense that when a child, at age, just say 6, goes to school and it's their first time learning how to read Arabic, they're introduced to words in standard Arabic, but those words are many times quite different from the words that they know at home. I show here some examples of, the many different ways that you can say the word tomato, kind of allusion across Arabic dialects, but also there are sometimes the same word, like this word barad, that could actually mean both a kettle or a fridge, depending on where you are. And so when we talk about readability, we have to be aware of this question of what is it that our readers kind of come to the text with, to start with, when they approach it. Okay, so jumping into the SAMR project. So my colleague Mohammed Al-Khalil hinted at some of the earlier challenges that he had to deal with selecting appropriate partners to work with and data sets to work with. I'm going to actually skip that part and just jump to the results that we had. We can bring it up again during the discussion if need be. But one of the design decisions that we made was to actually focus on a vocabulary labeling or rating approach. And we looked at ways of combining information from frequency and intuition-based approaches that basically, test, given a particular vocabulary, what is it that we intuit that a speaker or a reader of a certain age or grade should be able to know. And based on this, we identified 5 different levels. The details of these levels are described in our paper from LREC 2020. And we used 3 language professionals who basically came from 3 different areas from the Arab world, one from the Gulf, from the Egypt, to kind of acknowledge our awareness of the variations in the dialectal backdrop that we're dealing with. And to identify the words, we went with the concept of the lemma, which also was introduced a bit earlier by one of our other speakers. And for this, we used the system called Medamira to analyze an 11 million word corpus. We chose the corpus to be about half news from GigaWord and half Hindawi novels. So these are from the Hindawi website. They're all basically Arabic novels. Most of the novels that we used were all out of copyright, basically a bit older language, which is exactly what we're trying to focus on for this task. From these 11 million words, we were able to identify 26,000 and change lemmas, and those are the ones that we basically targeted the labeling of. So every single lemma was provided with its part of speech and its English class that came out of the Medamira system, and also and then it was provided independently to the 3 professionals that I mentioned, and they gave a level of between 1 and 5, following the guidelines that we had. We then eventually grouped those numbers to generate, to basically take the average as the official level that we use in the tools that we described later. But all of the intermediate results are actually publicly available, and this lexicon is downloadable from our website. Just to give a sense of what we actually got here, so you would see at the top right-hand side the number of types. Type is the term we use in NLP for unique words, basically. So how many unique terms we have versus how many tokens we have. And as our first speaker, Professor Anthony said, there's definitely clearly a Zipfian distribution. Within the level 1, you get 52% of the full vocabulary that is actually used in the tokens, or half of the corpus almost. And then you have, of course, it's a much smaller count when you count uniquely. Now, you could say why I mentioned 11 million, but there is 8 million. The 8 million excludes all punctuations and digits and all of the other stuff that is actually irrelevant to the counting. So this is basically off the list of the actual words. The second table at the bottom shows the level distance between any of the two different pairs that we got. Sorry, the maximum and the minimum, basically leveling difference between the three people that we asked to annotate. So ideally, we will want this to be 0, meaning there is no leveling difference. They would all say this word is level 3, 3, and 3, and that's what get us a 0. But in fact, that wasn't the case. We found about 66% of the time the level difference was 1. Now that's actually good in a sense, in a scale of 5. You know, to have the majority over 90, almost 99%, are basically between a distance of 0 and a distance of 1, whereas basically the remainder is just a minute number of cases. So we take this as evidence that this approach is actually a viable approach for making these kind of decisions. So of course we're curious, what are these things where differences were very wide? And in fact, they turn out to be words that happen to be dialectally marked. So for example, at the top level, you see the word mish, which is basically a kind of fermented salty cheese eaten in Egypt. There it got a level 1. A child would be aware of this word, but a child or a person in the Levant would have to be well educated and aware of other Arab countries' cultures to be able to see this. And the list go on with many, many similar examples. Just another kind of point we wanted to make that's really important about the challenge, and then this paper actually discusses it in more detail, the challenge of looking at frequency as opposed to looking at this intuitive leveling. There's a lot of analysis in the paper about this issue. The problem is, when you talk about frequency of what? It depends, what is it that you're counting the frequency over? So one of the main observations that actually motivated our interest in the intuitive approach for labeling the vocabulary was that basic words, like a word for rabbit or turtle, for example, we expect the child to be aware of, but in fact, that word does not appear at all in most corpora, because it appears in children's text corpora primarily, but will not appear as a very frequent term, you know, in news or novels, etc. And here I'm just showing some examples of the diversity of across different sections, where I put, you know, here like very high frequency, medium, and very low frequency, and you would see a lot of variety. Even in the lowest, in the tail end, when the frequency is in the 20s, you can find things that are of level 1 or level 5, you know, varying, right? So this is kind of a place where just using frequency may not actually be the best solution for us. And of course, I just want to point out that we said 26,000. In fact, we've added another 10,000 after this paper was published, and this data will be available soon. So there's a nice web interface that we developed based on this. I can actually show it if the link is there, if you want to take a screenshot of this to play with it. But when you put the term in it, it takes the word in any inflected form. So this is kind of great when you're not a native speaker or you're not really sure in the context how to tokenize these words. You put in the word, this is the word waw, ha, dal, nun, alif, could be pronounced in many different ways. At least here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different lamata that come out of it, and they are at varying levels between 3, 4, and 5. What we did in this work is we linked it to the Arabic WordNet effort to basically connect all of these pieces together so that we could actually look at a particular word, lama, of course, here, and look at what are its synonyms and what other levels these synonyms belong to. So you can see where we were going with this. We're basically trying to find ways to think, okay, how do I guide a person or a reader in understanding the meaning of a word that may be hard for them by mapping it to a synonym or another related word of an easier level that I expect them to know. And such a resource did not exist for Arabic before this work that we did in this project. Continuing with this, we took all of these elements, so our ability to do morphological analysis, the readability lexicon that we had created, and we connected it into building the SAMR simplification interface, which is a Google Doc add-on that basically, given some text, it actually will generate a document analysis level and a word level analysis for you. So this is very similar to some of the tools that were presented earlier today. One of the advantages of this particular tool, I would say, is that it actually sits inside of Google Doc, which is a very commonly used framework. So, I mean, after the presentation that was done earlier with Professor Anthony, I didn't think about using this for other languages, but I think, you know, that could be actually quite interesting to kind of use the same setup for other languages so that anybody can use them. I'll show you here this example. So this is text, basically. We click on the doc level here, and it shows the analysis on the size in a summary. Across the different levels. Notice that there's also another level we call names. So these are proper names. For our purposes, we counted them as outside of the leveling schema. There's also a percentage of words that are unknown, which we would consider then even harder than the hardest level we know. So they're in the far end tail, so to speak. And sometimes, of course, these are incorrect because we use morphological analysis and disambiguation. This model is quite fast, as you saw, and part of it is because it's using a very simple unigram lemma model to actually make the decision. So it's not the strongest model that we have compared to, say, using the Camelira system that I had hinted to earlier. But it actually can allow you to get quite far in being able to analyze. So if I pick an example, let's say this one, and I pick at the word level, I would get an analysis. Basically, it basically said there are two different readings, and it doesn't tell me here which one is the right one necessarily. But it has also all these beautiful links to synonyms that I mentioned earlier. So in this particular example, مما يثير شجون النفس, shujun is a form of anxiety or sadness. It's the plural of the word shajan in this case. So this is actually a correct analysis. It's a level 4. And here it gives me that, sorry, this is a bit too small perhaps for some of you to read, even for the Arabic readers. Talk about legibility earlier. So you get words like huzn or asaf, which are level 1, or inzi'aj or mushkila, right? So this kind of gives the person who is engaged in the task of doing simplification the opportunity to kind of brainstorm, and with some of these available features, to kind of rewrite the text and then rerun the document analysis level to get the new distributions. So again, you know, this is all public and open source, and it's linked also from our website. And I just kind of showed the example that uses this. I should point out here that the limitation on the synonyms and hypernyms, etc., is really coming primarily from the Arabic WordNet project, which is a really impressive project. But of course, it had a limited amount of time and resources, I'm sure. And I believe it's close to 8,000 or so lemata that we actually have information for. So it's not covering the full lexicon. Now, the last part I want to mention is the work that we did, or that almost, it's not published yet, actually, so I will be brief about it. This is kind of the final effort that was done in the SAMR project, which is to create a simplification corpus. And here, we basically selected 15 novels, all out of copyright. And you can see, I mean, you cannot read the Arabic if you don't read it, but you can see the dates ranging from about 1150, which is an estimated date for the Hayy bin Yaqan writing, up to 1955. And these are basically authors. We tried to balance them as much as we could, but writers from that period mostly came from either Egypt or Lebanon, Syria. So that's kind of what we ended up having. There's not a lot of diversity across the Arab world much. I think there's one Algerian writer, the Ahmad Rida, but that's about it. And what we did here is we selected about 10,000 words on chapter boundaries from the beginning of each one of these novels. We used the tool that we had that I demonstrated a bit earlier with our annotators, and we basically asked them to start with the original and simplify to level 4 and then simplify to level 3. Okay, what does that mean? We define simplification in this case as basically meaning that the hardest vocabulary item in the text will be from that level. I'm aware that this is not the same as that 95% that was discussed earlier, or some other maybe different goals that basically designers of these texts may have. Our view on this was that we needed something to kind of give our people a target also, so that they can be perhaps, you know, more consistent in the choices that they're making. And the other thing that we did is we separated the concept of simplification from abridgment. So this is not about simplifying the content for a child, but rather simplifying the language to the readability level while maintaining the same length. This is kind of interesting because it basically, the way I would compare it is, think of like a person who is, let's say, learned to read in older age, not a child, but a person who's older, who is at the reading level of, let's say, a third grader. You know, this kind of serves them. You know, we're not worried about them having trouble with a topic that may be, you know, a bit problematic, let's say, to discuss with children. This also applies potentially for learners of other languages. Another way to think of it is, I tried to, many times when we were designing the guidelines, I imagine trying to explain some text to one of my nephews who grew up in the West, so he's a heritage speaker, and I would kind of say, okay, this sentence, it's as if you replace this word with that word. So here you can see an example of our original text and simplified text. The number of words is almost the same. Sometimes, of course, we would have to paraphrase and change agreement patterns if you go from a masculine form to a feminine form. For a particular noun, you know, you would have to actually adjust the context around it. But what we did there is to basically, for the first time now, we have parallel data in 3 different readability level: original, which is typically 5, level 4, and level 3. And this paper is currently planned for publication soon. The moment that happens, all of this data will be available, and I'm sure, I hope people will use it. There's a lot of interesting exercises and tasks that we can develop on top of it. So to conclude, I am happy that I presented this effort. You know, thanks my colleague Mohammed Al Khalil and I. You know, we started talking about this probably about 8 or 9 years ago, and took some time for us to get funding for the project and worked on it, and, you know, survived through the COVID dramas and all of the stuff and kept this project going. And thanks to all of the students who helped us accomplish what we did. So all of these resources, I said, are going to be public. Some of them are already public and downloadable and usable. Our goal in the long term is to find ways to extend these resources and also to utilize them into doing other things beyond the simplification of the masterpieces, but to go into other usages for, you know, personalization, for example, of text generation, among many other ideas and thoughts. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Nizar. Again, very interesting project and work, of course, thanks to you, Mohammed Al Khalil, in this chat as well. So we've got a few questions, but we don't have much time. So I'll try to summarize them. And I'll also want to ask you a question with an example that you might hate me for. But
sure. No.
So for things like, you've used an example, I'm going to speak Arabic now, but you've used an example of bukle, which actually means a ribbon or something like that.
Oh.
And then you also used an example about ajaja, and I think that means something like dust and things like this. But then how does that differentiate between someone saying bukle ajaja? I know it sounds very dialect.
Oh, so bukla ajaja in the sense that you have a chicken with a little hair, what do you call it, pin or something on it. I mean, yeah, no, that's a really great question. I mean, it's the kind of stuff that I love to be able to solve. So first of all, the ajaja part is dialectal. If you put the word ajaja right now in our morphological analyzer for standard Arabic, it will actually give you the analysis that is the standard Arabic analysis. I'm actually very curious to just put it in the morphological analyzer that we have right now, because we do support dialectal. So book لعجاجة. Oh my God. Okay, I got it. So it did not actually. I mean, it did not make sense of it basically in that sense. But if I say treated as Levantine, oh, it does عجاجة. Here it is.
Okay, that's good.
So it guesses that the lemma is jaja, and
Okay.
is the preposition, but bukle gets analyzed bikullahu, which doesn't make
that's why I was like wondering.
The situation in the dialect is much worse in terms of resources, but the question of readability in the dialect, which is kind of almost what you're taking my hand toward, is a lot more interesting actually. So I enjoy reading texts written like novels written in the dialects. I find Egyptian novels so much easier to read. It's like my speed is much faster. I'm not Egyptian myself, but I'm exposed, obviously, like many people, to Egyptian Arabic. It just flows so much faster, right? And probably the vocabulary is a lot more familiar. It's easier, and the topics, as Violetta hinted earlier, are more fun, so that's why we're able to kind of be more engaged in them. I'm not aware of any work on readability in dialectal Arabic, but that's kind of a really interesting direction potentially.
Yeah, so that's what I'm actually interested in. we can have like a discussion, and we call the paper.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, Nizar, so I'm going to just summarize the other questions quickly. So basically the question saying, how did you decide on those different levels, so 1 to 5? And then 2, have you tried on other languages like English or dialects? And I think the dialects is already answered. And finally, is the corpus available? Sorry, just to summarize them all together.
Excellent. Yeah, so excellent. So for the 5 levels, I can give you my quick version of it, but Mohammed, actually, I would credit him with the development of the decisions on it. I mean, it could have been 5, it could have been 7, it could have been 3. 5 seemed like a reasonable number in terms of the leveling. We could actually compare it to other leveling schemas that we've seen in other places. And the definitions of it were based on basically pedagogical purposes of what do we expect of certain grade levels. Mohammed can add more, but let me answer the rest of your questions. The decision about which vocabulary we selected was simply based on those that appeared in the corpus that we were working with. And eventually we covered all of the SAMA lexicon, which is basically its lemata are what we use inside of Camel Tools and the rest of our tools. The corpus will be available, but we literally just got this stuff at the beginning of the summer. We are writing a paper on it. We want to basically publish it with the paper. I hope the moment, depends on Bashar who's on the call, the moment we get the paper submitted and it is possible to, within the anonymity period, we could probably put the data out for people to start playing with the corpus. Yeah.
Thank you, Nizar.
Mohammed, if you're there, maybe you can elaborate on the choice of the levels.
Yes, very quickly, the levels really are based on cognitive development of the child learnings, or the personal development, and this is drawn on Fountain Sentinel research in readings, and probably the book is actually, if like a guided reading, this is Fountain Sentinel. It's research in mostly cognitive and educational research on reading. So the 5 levels are really the stages that a person goes through in learning. They have a different gradient. Actually, they use a gradient, a very famous gradient in classifying levels of reading materials, which we could not use. We just wanted to use the more basic ones they have. They have a larger one. So that's my brief answer. But if you want to, if you have a chance, we can talk in the break or more about this.
Thanks a lot.
And as I said, I will be putting the slides, all of them, on the website, the Samer.Camel Lab website that I showed earlier. And I'll put a note about it in the chat for everybody.
Thank you very much, Nizar. Okay, so we move on to the next talk. I don't see Igleka in the list of attendees, but Eva, I can see you there. Do you want to, or one of you jump in? And just gonna look at the chat and see who is responding. Oh, you are there. Sorry, it's just the the language. All right, so let me just have you as a presenter. Where is that? Or if you have access already, can you please start sharing. All right, let me see. People. Yeah, I think it's not popping up.
I just made her.
I think it's.
Oh, thanks for that. All right.
Great. All
Good.
right.
So, all right. So while you share your screen, I'll just present you, and then we'll go next. So, and sorry, we're late. I'm really sorry about like the 5 minutes delay, but it was a very interesting chats before that. All right. So the next talk is by. I can hear myself twice. I was just wondering. Okay, so it's Iglika Nikolova Shtupak and also Eva Schoffel-Lacroix and Gail Lujan. So I think hopefully pronounced that correctly. So the work is on readability of Inter-Slavic as a measure of languages naturalness. So the stage is yours now, Iglika. So whenever you want, please go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much. I hope you can see my screen now.
Yeah. And we can hear you fine.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for this workshop. It is really inspiring and helpful for people whose lines of research include readability. So I will be presenting the readability of an interesting language, Inter-Slavic, as a measure of the language's naturalness. I will start with a short introduction of the Inter-Slavic language. It is a very specific language in that it is a zonal auxiliary language, which means that it has been specifically composed in order to facilitate communication between speakers of Slavic languages, as opposed to, let's say, Esperanto, which is an international auxiliary language. Also, it is a relatively recently developed language, dating from 2011, although there have been several different experiments under a different name, Sloviansky, around 2006. So the language is meant to be a continuation of Old Church Slavonic, which is the first Pan-Slavic language that was used between the 9th and 11th centuries. As stated by Nikolova 2022, mathematics and computer software were used in order to generate the language's grammar, orthography, syntax, and vocabulary. Also, the language has several different versions, such as different scripts or different alphabets used, Cyrillic, Latin, and even Glagolithic, which is the first Slavic alphabet, and it is rather complex looking. For the purpose of this study, we will focus on the Cyrillic script as a typical Slavic language script. And some of the prominent features of the language include it having 3 genders, 2 numbers, 6 grammatical cases, verbal aspect, and no articles, which are all features that tend to be shared among Slavic languages. The approach is going to be an evaluation of a number of identical texts, that is to say translations of one text, as a way to evaluate complexity, the way it can be compared interlingually. Such a similar line of research was pursued by Juola in 1998. However, there the focus was on morphology alone and also on the way informativeness relates to compressibility in textual samples. Where relevant, previous readability research concerning the examined languages will be applied. For instance, as per Solnishkina et al. From 2018, a long word in the Russian language and by extension in other highly morphological Slavic languages, a long word is considered to have over 11 letters, while this is not the case, let's say, for English. The readability features that are going to be applied fall into 4 main categories: length-based, lexical, syntactic, and discourse-related. The way the work has been completed is mostly automatically with Python's natural language processing libraries. However, there have been instances, especially due to the lack of resources in Interslavic, that manual counting and manual calculations have been made. So there are 2 tasks that I will be presenting. The one deals with the way Interslavic falls within a framework of Slavic languages. So 3 Slavic languages are taken as representative. They are members of the 3 main branches of Slavic languages: Bulgarian, which is South Slavic, Polish, Central Slavic, and Russian, which is East Slavic. And then for the second experiment, the way Interslavic fits as a modern inheritor of Old Church Slavonic is examined. In particular, complexity ratios are taken between Interslavic and Old Church Slavonic on one side, and Italian and Latin on the other. So one old and one modern language. Italian has been taken in particular as it is considered to be the closest Roman language to Latin. So for task 1, the general pipeline will involve applying a variety of readability features to translations of The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry in the examined Slavic languages. Then eventually 2 representative features will be taken per the 4 discussed types. And finally, the overall complexity of the texts in the different languages will be calculated according to the selected features. So starting with the length-based features, they include textual length, average number of characters per word, percentage of long words, as mentioned, over 11 letters, the average number of syllables per word, and the average number of syllables per sentence. These are all traditional length-based readability metrics. In particular, for instance, the number of syllables rather than words per sentence is taken as Slavic languages tend to be highly morphological, as mentioned. So a lot of the information is carried within the same word. As for the results, I will not have time to go over them in high detail, but they are natural and to be expected. In general, Polish tends to strike with being rather complex, and Interslavic tends to fall somewhere in between the other Slavic languages examined. Moving on to lexical features, there comes the type token ratio, or the words used as compared with the overall number of words or the vocabulary within a text. Usually this metric can be problematic because it is rather length dependent. However, as the textual lengths are practically the same, this is not a problem here. And also the percentage of hapax legomena, or words that are used only once. So high values of these 2 features speak of complexity of the language. Here, the tool used for lemmatizing the text was Simplemma, as naturally it is better to use lemmatized text. The concept of lemma was discussed a little bit earlier, as 2 very highly related words would be taken to be different unless this kind of pre-processing is undergone. However, unfortunately, there is no software available to perform lemmatization of Inter-Slavic. So instead, lemmatizer for Russian was used, and the results showed that it did not perform well enough. So as the ratios between the two types of text, lemmatized and non-lemmatized, were pretty similar for the other three languages, eventually the non-lemmatized versions were opted for. Moving on to the syntactic features, or syntactic and morphological. The percentage of adjectives and adverbs was taken as a simple measure of the complexity of a sentence. Here, there are many options, such as dependencies or number of subordinate clauses, for instance. But adjectives and adverbs add secondary information, so they also imply complexity. And in order to be able to tell the presence of these different types of speech, the tool Stanza was used for part of speech tagging. And once again, the resource was not available for Inter-Slavic. The other alternative languages were utilized, but results were not good enough. So eventually, results were manually adjusted. The same happened in the case of percentage of prepositions and articles. And the final measure is the number of inflections per noun. Actually, the second and third measures are supposed to complement each other, as the prepositions and articles tend to be typically used in more analytical languages, while the number of inflections, like a high number of inflections, would normally suppose more synthetic language, such as the Slavic languages that have cases. Out of the 4 languages examined, only Bulgarian, my native language, actually does not involve a case system. So in the case of Bulgarian, inflections would be, let's say, as we are looking only at nouns for the purpose of this experiment, pluralization, as well as articles, as articles in Bulgarian are postfixed. While in the other Slavic languages, it would typically involve pluralization and a case or combinations thereof. And finally, discourse-related features. First comes the pronouns to nouns ratio. This is an instance of anaphora, or a particular textual entity needing another one in order to be correctly interpreted. So a high number of pronouns would imply high complexity of the text. Once again, this measure was manually adjusted due to the inability of alternative taggers to correctly interpret Inter-Slavic. And another measure that was used is cosine distance. That is to say, the distance between the embeddings of consecutive sentences. The general idea being that 2 consecutive sentences would be closer together in meaning if the text is easier to understand. For the purpose, 3 random pairs of consecutive sentences were taken per language, and their values were averaged. So the overall complexity was calculated in the following manner. So 2 representative features that are the variety that contribute the most with information were taken per category. They all underwent min-max normalization. That is to say, they were given values between 0 and 1. And then the language complexity was taken to be the average of all of these features as considered to have the same weight. As we can see in the last column, overall complexity, Inter-Slavic rates third in complexity. And its value comes quite close to those of Bulgarian and Russian, whilst Polish tends to be significantly more complex. Then for task 2, here a limitation was the lack of identical texts of considerable length in Inter-Slavic and Old Church Slavonic. So 2 original texts were used. One is, once again, The Little Prince, taken in its Latin, Italian, and Inter-Slavic versions. And the other one is 1 Samuel 17, a chapter of the Bible, also known as the David and Goliath story, and often seen as one of the simplest stories in the Bible. So here the languages are Latin, Italian, and Old Church Slavonic. Once again, the selected features will be applied to all texts that are examined. And then a plausible complexity ratio will be derived for Inter-Slavic to Old Church Slavonic. So here comes a similar table to the one previously seen. The results are once again explainable and consistent. For instance, Latin texts demonstrate high complexity, and the biblical text demonstrates higher complexity than The Little Prince. The study makes use of the assumption that has been made, for instance, by Sherman in the late 19th century, in the beginning of readability studies, that language tends to become less complex, and written text tends to become closer to spoken text with time. So the ratios were calculated for the following couples of texts: the biblical story in Italian to Latin, The Little Prince in Italian to Latin, and then The Little Prince in Italian compared to the biblical story in Latin, and finally The Little Prince in Inter-Slavic compared to the biblical story in Old Church Slavonic, and the ratios are presented. One can notice that the ratios differ significantly when it comes to Italian in relation to Latin, when it comes to the 2 discrete texts. So it is text dependent. Of course, there are other variables at play too. For instance, the fact that although it is in Latin, The Little Prince is actually modernly written. So in order to come up with a plausible ratio of 2 identical texts in Inter-Slavic and Old Church Slavonic, the differences or the ratios between the relationships between these 2 different texts in Italian and Latin were compared to the ratios where the text is the same. And when these calculations are made, what issues is that the ratio would fall somewhere between 0.55 and 0.85. And as for the fact that the ratio seems to be a little bit more in the favor of Inter-Slavic being complex, one just educated guess would be the presence of the complex case system that is present in Inter-Slavic, as opposed to, let's say, Italian, where it has disappeared from the original Latin with its case system. So as conclusion, we saw that the Inter-Slavic language has a highly natural level of complexity comparable to other Slavic languages, and also modern in terms of an assumed decrease of complexity over time. However, there are a couple of problematic points, such as the fact that Inter-Slavic does not come as less complex than other Slavic languages, whilst its recent generation would make one think that this will be the case. And also, again, in a related note, it may not be sufficiently simpler than its predecessor, Old Church Slavonic. So a possible element to examine would be a simplification of the case system of Interslavic and how it would affect its understanding. In fact, there exist currently different so-called flavorizations of Interslavic, where Interslavic texts could be made automatically to resemble more a particular Slavic language or a particular group of Slavic languages. For instance, as presented to a Bulgarian audience, a text may be made to get rid of the case system. And also something that becomes really evident concerning this research is that tools for natural language processing of Interslavic and even Old Church Slavonic, which are also lacking, would be very useful for further research, such as, for instance, lemmatizers and part-of-speech taggers, as we saw in this study. Okay, I'm just putting here the translations and books used for the study and general bibliography. This will be all. Thank you very much for listening, and you're welcome to ask questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Egleka. And since I'm in Bulgaria, I should say Blagodaria, right? Is that correct?
Wow. Yes, absolutely.
I'm attending RANLP, so I am in Varna at the moment.
Oh, that's so cool.
Good.
Great.
So that's really interesting talk. And I mean, I didn't know anything about like Interslavic before, and I found that very interesting. And from an NLP perspective, I'm also interested to see like whether fine-tuning any of the language models currently available for the other natural Slavic languages would actually enhance. I mean, I don't know, like one of them could maybe work better than the other. So I see a question from Violetta who said, do you know why the decision was made to retrain cases in Interslavic, or retain cases in Interslavic? Sorry, not retrain.
Yes, this is an interesting point. I'm not sure I would give the exact answer that the person who came up with the system had in mind, but the Interslavic language has maybe an array of purposes, the most obvious one being communication between different speakers of different languages. But then another one would be kind of a celebration of Slavic languages in a way, and presenting Slavic languages as a whole to speakers of other unrelated languages. So without the case system, one cannot truly say that they have general knowledge of Slavic languages.
Thank you. And then the other question, try to summarize what Mohammed said. So I think the question says that first, where is this learned? Like, do they learn it like from younger age? And then two, is it looked at as kind of like not the standard language that should have been used? So it's comparing like MSA to dialects and all the discussions that we've heard before.
Yes, very interesting point. Well, currently there is a relatively active online community of sharing and practicing the language. I do not think that anyone is learning it naturally, let's say starting as a child, as of yet. I will be curious to find out if something like this becomes available. But there is, for example, a Reddit forum. There is a magazine called Sloviani. There are active Facebook groups where people can practice the language. There are a couple of good textbooks as well. It is a very vivid language, I would say. It has a YouTube channel. It's really meant to encourage communication, and in particular communication with speakers who are not native speakers of a Slavic language. So I think there are opportunities to get acquainted with and practice this language. I can provide links. I will be happy to.
Yeah, if you want to put those in the chat, that'll be
Absolutely.
fine. But
sure.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Egleka. That's really interesting. Really appreciate your time. And we're going to move on now to the next talk. So the last talk, what we call spotlight talk, is the one that just before lunch break. So that is Nizar Habash again, and it's going to be about the projects that he's working on. I think Nizar is around. I'll give him a minute. And also I wanted to say that there will be lunch break after this. So I'd expect you to go and have lunch. But if you want to sit around and then chat to any of the speakers, or if like in Nizar's discussion, go further, feel free to sit around and follow that. And one last thing I want to say is I'm having to leave after the lunch break just because I'm attending a conference, and then my colleague, Dr. Abdul Karim Tamimi, will take over chairing the next sessions. So, hi, Nizar.
Hi.
Okay,
I think I'm sharing my screen, right? Do you see my screen shared? Okay.
Yeah, I see myself. Maybe you need to maximize the slides.
Yeah, 1 second. There we go.
So we changed the order before, Nizar, so we were supposed to introduce you first when you talk about this one, but you've already introduced yourself in the previous one. So I'm just going to mention the title and then hand back to you. So
sure.
This is a spotlight talk. This is not a paper or abstract submitted, well, kind of submitted to the workshop. So Nizar is going to talk to us about BARIC, I think, and that's the Balanced Arabic Readability Evaluation Corpus, and that was done with Zayed University through Professor Hanada Taha. So back to you, Nizar, and got the stage now.
Yeah, so thanks, Mo. This is a different kind of a talk, and I'm really sorry to appear twice, I'm hogging things. I apologize if you get tired of me. This actually is a paper about a project that literally started 5 days ago. Officially, we've been working on the proposal, etc., but its official starting date is the beginning of September of 2023. So we're just starting, and it just seems like the stars are aligning with you guys organizing this readability for low resource language workshop. So we thought this would be a nice opportunity to kind of do our introduction to the community. This will be a shorter talk where more time will be going to maybe questions and answers and discussions. So as was already mentioned, this is a collaboration between New York University, Abu Dhabi, and Zayed University in my person, and also Professor Hanada Taha, who I think is also joining. And the funding came to us through the Abu Dhabi Arabic Language Center, which is a governmental organization in the UAE interested in promoting the Arabic language. So here's the link at the top to the current page. You won't see much on it because it just started, except information similar to this. And this is planned to be a 2.5-year effort. And the overarching goal of this effort is to develop comprehensive reference resource to facilitate the study and evaluation of Arabic readability across the Arab world and across different levels of readability. So as we know, there are lots of efforts that have gone actually in the space of developing children's books, particularly for ranking their different readabilities. And in the Arab market, you find books like this, efforts from I think this is Rabia Publishers, with their different colored levels. There's also Silsilat Mustawiyat al-Qira'a al-Arabiyya with their own levels on it. There's been other research that's been done. Of course, I mentioned already the work with my colleague Mohammed Al-Khalil on the SAMR project. But specifically, I'm leading us to talk about the Hanada Taha, who is the lady in the title, the professor in the title of this, my colleague, who had developed a system for leveling books, and it has actually been used to already classify over 9,000 books. And this was all done by hand. So as an NLP AI person, I'm just like, oh, this is really exciting and interesting. And what can we do from an NLP point of view to actually take this? So Hanada and I had long discussions, many discussions about this, and it evolved into this project that I'm going to be talking about today. So a very brief comment about the Hanada Taha readability leveling scale. And if you have more questions, Hanada can answer them better than me. So this is book leveling. It's about readability leveling at a book level. So it includes elements that are readability related, but also legibility related, and many other kind of additional features in them. I tried, as part of understanding her book, to kind of go through all of the elements that she describes in her quite a large book of guidelines, basically for these levels. These levels are 19 levels labeled after the Arabic alphabet in the Abjad order, you know, the Abjad, Hawas, Hutti, Kalaman kind of order. And so it would include things, very detailed features about the degree of presence of diacritics, the size of the book in terms of words, the number of words per page, etc. Some of these, from a computational point of view, are kind of easy to model and easy to calculate. Other things require elements that need more AI for Arabic, like some of the stuff that I presented earlier, like, for example, being able to know that a particular word has an element of it that appears in the dialect is as a useful feature. We would need to get that information annotated or extracted independently. Then there's different topic modeling, etc. features. She also goes into syntactic details about, you know, patterns that are, you know, the structure of the sentence, how big is the sentence, you know, elements, whether you introduce direct object or not, etc. There's just a very lengthy, detailed analysis of this that she provides as guidance. Some examples of the books that were labeled in her system. Now, of course, I'm coming to this from the computational side, and thanks to Mohammed earlier asking a question that's really important about the use of syntax. It happens, by the way, that Hind Siddiqui, who was mentioned by Professor Cavalli Sforza, who was actually one of her team members who came and joined us on the SAMR project in the early days, we actually demonstrated the use of syntactic features for readability in the past using older versions of our Camel parser that uses dependency trees. But that was just used as an automatic feature. And what we wanted to do is to be able to actually get a bit more annotations kind of covered under this new project. So we actually managed to argue for it. I'm showing examples here of what a syntactic analysis in this space would look like for this sentence that appears from a book called Nora and the Corona, and kind of linking all of the different technological elements that we already have access to do something interesting in them. Okay, so this project plans to do the following. As I said, nothing exists yet. We're just starting. We've collected some of the books and materials, but so I'm telling you more of plans that we got. We managed to convince people to fund. So the plan was to create about a 10 million word corpus of text excerpts. So this is an important idea where we wanted to get as many texts and kind of make use of the fair use loophole that allows us to basically include text from copyrighted books, but as long as it's within a page or 2 pages of that text, then we can have a wide range of balance basically across. In our sense, in my mind, it's like the experience of what an educated Arab today would experience in terms of reading, from novels and even street signs to menus in restaurants to information about how to use medicine, you know, all the way to, you know, fancy novels to religious texts, etc. So the goal is to try to cover as much as possible. I have not seen something like this done in Arabic. I would love to be corrected and pointed in other directions if some of you know about it. But this is kind of one piece of the effort, is to kind of build this very wide range level of across readability and also across genres, and potentially also text origins if possible, meaning like which Arab countries they come from. A big chunk of the project will be dedicated to doing annotations of subsamples of the 10 million. So the 10 million words, 1 million of them will be annotated by breaking them into sentence segments. So we've had experience doing this in the tree banking project that was done at the Camel Lab called Camel Tree Bank. So we have guidelines to basically identify where a sentence segment is. For the non-Arabic speakers, it'd be like, what's the big deal? Punctuation? Yeah, Arabs don't use punctuation consistently, and published books sometimes don't actually use punctuations except at the end of paragraphs. And there's also this problem of two interpretations of the comma as a complete sentence or as a marker of a phrase. So we would have to kind of handle some of this as part of these guidelines. And then we would do the sentence level readability. So using the Hanada-Taha system. So here we have to actually, as part of this project, redefine or repurpose the guidelines that Hanada had developed from the book level to focus on the vocabulary aspects of them, so that we can say this sentence looks like it belongs in a book of a certain readability level. The assumption, the simplifying assumptions we're making here is that if you have the readability at the sentence level, which has enough of a context, unlike having vocabulary out of context, then you can go from that and talk about the readability of a whole book as a form of function over all of the readability levels of its components, its sentences. But that's the unit that we're basically targeting. And of course, this sample would be selected to be sub-representative, a representative sample of the larger corpus. Additionally, 100,000 words, also sub-selected from the 1 million in this case, will go through syntactic annotation in the Columbia Arabic Tree Bank Dependency Tree Style. This has been used, I mean, this is something I had worked on many years ago. We've developed a few tree banks in it, and also other groups have actually used it and used some of our tool to develop further tree banks in it. We think this could be a useful tool to basically annotate and get ways of benchmarking how good are we computationally at actually doing dependency trees for these genres and types of lower level or higher level text that have not actually been studied in Arabic. Finally, a 40,000 lemma lexicon that it's basically the same basic lemma set that came from the standard Arabic morphological analyzer.
I think we lost you for a second. Nizar, can you hear us? Still online.
AI tools. The goal here is to develop systems for automatic readability. Now that we've annotated these, or when we have annotated these millions of words, thousands, 20,000 or so, 80,000 sentences, I think is the estimate, we should be able to run experiments on predicting that readability level on them, automatically annotate the rest of the corpus. And the long-term goal that is in our partners in the Arabic Language Center in Abu Dhabi are interested in is developing systems that allow authors to make informed decisions about the target readabilities that they want to go for. And I'm going to stop here and basically say this is now about questions and answers. As I said, this is a new project, just started, literally fresh. So I would love to hear your feedback, criticism, anything you think is good, anything you think is bad, things to look out for, pointers to resources, pointers to collaborations, other efforts that you're aware of, and any other questions you may have, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nizar. So if you have any question, you can type in the chat. If you would like to chat or ask a question, you can just raise your hand and we will enable your mic so you can speak up and ask your question. All of these are very interesting projects. I just takes me back to when I started working